You begin on a road that is not quite a road, more a ribbon of tamped earth, pale where feet have crushed the dust flat and darker where cartwheels have worried ruts into the soil. In the hills northeast of Athens, the countryside of Attica is stitched together by such tracks. You follow one because people like you have always followed what lies underfoot, and because history, for all its bright stories, is most often carried on backs and legs. On this morning, the air is cool, it smells faintly of crushed thyme. Somewhere ahead, out of sight, a bell tinks against a strap. You are told there was once a modest tale in these hills, repeated in winter when vines looked like knotted fists, and men had time to talk. A farmer needed a beast to help him carry a needless but necessary load, and Dionysus, a god who understood burdens that look frivolous from afar, lent him a donkey. You're also told that the gods rode donkeys in painted scenes and processions, and that the rural Dionysia came each year with masks, garlands, and a long walk to the village shrine. You do not need to decide what is literal. In a world where religion is woven into tasks, the question is simpler. What did a loaned animal mean to a farmer in Attica? And how did such a small mercy alter the shape of a day? First you look at the land. The slopes here are shallow and patient. Terraces hold thin soils like shelves hold folded cloth. Vines are trained low, each trunk twisted, each spur pruned with attention learned from fathers and neighbours. The vine is a demanding plant. In winter, last year's growth is cut back. In spring, tendrils must be guided. In summer, excess leaves thinned to let sun strike the fruit. Among the vines, olives stand like slow clocks. They measure time in resilience, a hard frost, a dry year, a branch that bears poorly and then surprises you the next season. Wheat and barley are planted where the land allows a smoother field. You feel this mix in your step, the short shuffle between rows, the longer stride over open ground, the sidestep where terrace stones bulge with age. Tools in this world are simple and specific. The mattock with its blade set crosswise for loosening soil between vines. The two-handled pruning knife with a notch near the heel for catching and cutting a cane cleanly. A wooden yoke, bored for a strap, rests on two pegs outside a low storehouse. Inside, a stack of amphorae waits, their clay shoulders chalk-marked in a script you do not need to read to understand. Last year's wine, this year's must, an empty jar reserved for oil. Rope is twisted from flax and sometimes from the coarse hair combed off goats. Leather thongs, softened with tallow, hold everything together. You move closer to the sound of the bell. The donkey that wears it is the colour of dust with a stripe darker than shadow along its spine. A pack saddle, two simple pads stitched over wicker frames, sits on a back rubbed smooth where wood meets hide. The straps are adjusted carefully because saws start small and last long. On each side hang panniers woven from reed, ordinary as baskets. If you look closely, you see a careful repair where a splintered rib has been lashed to a sound one. Patience threaded through holes you would not notice unless you work with your hands. A farmer without such an animal is a fisherman without a boat, not helpless, but limited to the shallows. With a donkey, the farmer gathers prunings faster and hauls them for burning, brings back manure from a neighbour's fold, carries amphorae to a demarcated spot on the main track where a city dealer's cart will pass after market day. The animal changes time. You might walk the same distance twice, once empty, once loaded. With the donkey, you consolidate those trips into one. In a calendar organised by festivals and seasons, a small gain in a day may save you an entire day at the end of a week. You consider the calendar. In villages across Attica, the rural Dionysia arrives near the turning of the year, when wine from the recent vintage is ready to be acknowledged publicly, tasted with caution and traded with confidence. The festival is local, deme by deme, because roads make communities long rather than wide. There is a procession, a Pompeii with a phallic emblem lifted high, not for shock but for continuity, with ivy-crowned men and boys who carry baskets, with a skene, no more than planks and cloth, set up near a shrine to hold declamation or comedy. Masks smell of glue and damp reeds, torches leak pitch. At the back of such a procession you often find an animal that refuses urgency. The donkey will not be hurried, and so a god famous for wildness is honoured by a pace set to the pull of a halter and the comfort of steady hooves. You think of the farmer's problem because that is how most stories begin for people who work, a practical obstacle presented on a specific morning. Perhaps the farmer must bring 2 amphorae of last year's wine to the crossroad, where the dealer's man will meet him, and perhaps the amphorae are full enough that one cannot be balanced on the shoulder for long without bruising the flesh. Without a donkey, he contrives a pole passed through a loop of rope around the jar's neck, a neighbour's boy to carry the other end, frequent rests because clay jars are not forgiving. With a donkey, he loads both jars low, on either side, padding them with straw and old sacking, the weight snug against the animal's centre of gravity. You notice how this changes the route as well. A man balancing a jar cuts across terraces to shorten the climb. A man leading a laden animal favours the longer curve of the track where the footing is even and the grade gentler. The day opens differently because the path does. You step into that curve now, listening to the soft impact of hooves and the softer rattle of clay against wicker muted by straw. If you are inclined toward written sources, you may remember that Attic lore and custom touch these movements lightly but persistently. Boundary stones, hermae, stand where fields meet, their faces rubbed smooth by hands that enjoy contact with certainty. A neighbour may graze goats on this edge after harvest. Another may pass with a cart once a week by a right-of-way that predates the memory of the living. You do not need the precise phrasing of a decree to understand what it means to live among rules that are mostly unwritten, yet binding. The donkey respects none of this, but the man leading it does, and so the animal becomes a witness to a map of obligations as real as any temple. At the crossroad you pause, because crossroad pauses are older than paperwork. If the dealer's boy is late, you take out your knife and trim a strap that is stretched in the damp. You tug at a pannier's cord, you count in your head how many amphorae remain at home and what jars of oil can be spared after your wife has set aside what is needed for the lamps through spring. You note the condition of the animal's hooves. If an edge is chipped, you file it with a shard of rough pottery. You're not sentimental about the animal, but you are not careless either. A donkey is a thread. If it frays, the fabric thinly tolerates the strain, and then tears. The dealer's man arrives with a cart that shows money in its fittings. The iron tyres are better joined than most. The axle is greased with fat darkened by road dust. He checks the amphorae, not by tasting, the arrangement is already made, but by tapping the clay with a knuckle. The tone tells him the jar is whole. He scribbles a mark with charcoal on a sliver of wood, and you understand that this will correlate to a number in someone else's head. Payment is not always coin. It may be promise, or a bundle of wool to be collected next week, or a small discount on an iron share you will need before spring ploughing. Arrangements in such a world are a chain, weak in places, strong enough in most. The donkey is indifferent to credit and debt, but the animal enables both, and so you pat its neck as if to acknowledge a role no human voice will honour. On the way home you angle to the well because a loaded animal is thirsty, and so are you. The well's water is brackish in summer but sweet now. The rope is new, the bucket is old. The pulley complains with a note like a small flute. You pour water into a shallow stone basin chipped just where an impatient hoof nudges it while waiting. You drink from your hand. You notice that the animal's left ear has a notch, likely from an old bite. You notice too how the animal stands when resting, one hind hoof cocked, the weight shifting in a rhythm that makes sense once you've felt it for a few minutes. If the tale is right, this is the part of the day when someone says it aloud. They say Dionysus once lent his own donkey for a morning like this. You do not argue. The painted pots that travel from city to farm show the god with a satyr and a long-suffering animal that knows every stone in the road. Processions that honour him do not move without 4 legs to carry vessels, costumes, poles, and fatigue. A loaned animal is therefore a kind of ritual as well as a kindness. In such a statement, the border between worship and work blurs and becomes, for a practical moment, irrelevant. There is more to carry. Prunings wait in a heap near the vineyard's edge, a thorny, tangled testimony to careful winter work. You lift and stack them onto the panniers and secure them with a net of cord. These cut canes are fuel for the oven and brush for the first burn that cleans a field. You cut your hands twice, but not badly. Splinters in this climate come out cleanly if you do not delay. The animal stands while you lift, steps forward when you click your tongue, and stops when you lay your hand on its shoulder. You have learned these cues from your father and from men older than him, and because you seldom speak while working, the sounds grow precise like tools. At home the yard is small but ordered. A fig tree leans into a corner to escape the north wind. Chickens mutter and scratch. They are not truly yours because they wander to neighbours and back, but you count them each evening all the same. The threshing floor is a hard disc of earth burnished to a gloss by years of circular motion. The storehouse door is low enough that you bow as you step through, not out of reverence but because this is the most economical way to build a lintel that resists sag. A clay hearth, coiled and smoothed by hand, shows the smoke's history in rings of stain. At the wall, a shelf holds 3 small terracotta figures blackened by soot. If you ask anyone whose faces they bear, the answer would be comfortable and non-committal, the ones who mind the house. A donkey eats little for its usefulness. Straw, cut vine canes, weeds you pull from field edges, a measure of barley husks if the day has been long. You rub a little oil into the straps where they crack. You dry the animal's back with a square of cloth because sweat under a saddle rubs into sores, and sores mean days lost later. You do these things because your father did them, and because a pattern that keeps a poor family even with itself is as valuable as any new idea. This is how tradition lives, not as a story repeated for entertainment, but as a sequence of motions repeated for survival. The rural Dionysia will come soon. You think ahead, because work calls for a mind that sits in both present and near future at once. Garlands of ivy will be cut and soaked so they do not wilt too quickly. A ladder will be checked before leaning it against a tree. The lower rung cracked by a boy's foot last year has finally been replaced. A strip of linen must be washed and twisted into a headband for your eldest. You will walk with neighbours toward the dim small shrine. Some will sing, some will pretend to sing. The donkey will carry the mask box and a sack of dried figs and a jar of diluted wine that will be poured for anyone whose throat thickens with dust. People will say that the god is present. You will not argue because presence in practice is a shared willingness to say thank you for harvest and hope for spring. A loaned animal on a workday feels in the mouth like the same word. If you tilt the picture only slightly, you see how this day inscribes itself into the record that no scribe keeps. The dealer's boy will remember that your amphorae are carefully sealed. The neighbour's child will remember that your ladder is safe and copy the mortise you used in a tool of his own. Your wife will remember that 2 pannier straps are near the end of their useful lives and will barter wool for leather with a cousin at market. The donkey will remember where the well basin stands and swing its head to the right the next time you pass, causing you to smile because memory in a beast is both convenient and companionable. You're tempted, perhaps, to lift your eyes to the larger city. In Athens proper, there are decrees, lists, lawsuits, stone cut with words that travel forward in time more easily than breath. But the countryside keeps the city upright. Amphorae move, oil drips into lamps, men show up with sandals to stand in assembly, because women and boys and animals have kept the farm steady enough that absence for a day does not unspool the week. When you hold a cup in winter and it smells of resin and last summer's hillsides, you're not thinking of poetry. You're thinking of a god who knows that pleasure depends on logistics, and of a donkey whose steadiness makes room for both. So you end the day where you began, on a track that is both private and public, worn by years of ordinary intention. The bell tinks. The animal lowers its head to worry at a tuft of grass that has somehow survived near a stone. Someone repeats the tale of a divine loan, not to prove the gods care about individuals, but to remind you that kindness is a kind of worship, and that animals, like men, can be made sacred by the task they perform patiently. You accept that a small change, a few hours with a borrowed back, has kept a household within its margins. And if a god is credited, perhaps that is another way the community thanks itself without asking any one neighbour to stand up and blush. Perhaps the god's donkey and the neighbour's donkey are, for practical purposes, the same animal, on the same morning in the same light. You nod, you rub the dust from the animal's brow with your knuckles, and you consider the next day's list. If you listen carefully, you will hear one last thought asking for attention, like the bell after it has stopped moving. When a festival begins with a procession paced by hooves, what other small loans of labour and kindness have made its joy possible, and which of those loans will be remembered in anything more durable than a tale told between vines and a well? You begin the second stretch, of the day and the place where most work truly happens, the yard between house and field, half shadowed by an awning of woven reeds and half baked by sun that finds every gap in the slats. You notice how little here is decorative. Beauty is a consequence, not a goal. The sort of beauty that comes when objects are pared down to their use, and then polished by hands repeating the same motion through seasons. A water jar shows a thumb's hollow at the lip where pouring is always steadied. The door latch shines where it is lifted and set down. Even the donkey's bell, bright on its first festival day long ago, is now dulled to the colour of barley. You lean into the household because a farmer's day interlaces fieldwork and housework with a rope that does not break. Inside the dim room, a long-necked amphora is set upright in a cradle of packed earth. A woman leans over it with a folded cloth dampened in warm water, wiping resin and dust from the rim and neck. You understand why. When wine is decanted, the lip must be clean or the cord will slip and a seal will not hold. On the floor stands a small crater, its paint worn but its capacity reliable. Next to it, a wooden dipper floats in a basin where water is kept to settle. You remember that wine is not drunk neat at meals. It is mixed with water, often 2 or 3 to 1, sometimes more in the heat. Men boast of strong wine, but households live by ratios. Near the open door, a loom stands with weighted warps. Clay loom weights, each one marked with a scratched line that likely means nothing beyond ownership, hang in neat ranks. The weaver's shuttle moves with a rhythm you fall into as easily as footsteps. Cloth is not spun with idle hands. It is spun because every season eats fabric. Sacks that chafe through on donkey panniers, headbands that fray, tunics rubbed thin where tools hang from a belt. The wool smells faintly of olive oil because a little oil on the fingers slicks the fibres for a tighter twist. A basket holds distaffs and spindles. In a corner, a chest keeps the good cloth, the one to become a dowry piece for a girl whose marriage looks near only if the next harvest does not surprise everyone by being poor. You notice the order that sits under the surface of this busy stillness. In the corner stands a tall pythos, its opening covered with a flat stone and a round of waxed linen. Grain sleeps there, safe from mice by a collar of thorns laid around the base, and from damp by a thin layer of ash on the floor. Next to it, a shallow ceramic tray catches the leavings of meals, fish bones, olive pits, the stubs of figs, mixed with sweepings from the yard. This tray will go to the midden, and then the midden will go to the field when the season asks for it. Nothing is wasted that can be persuaded to work again. Outside, the donkey flicks an ear as if it too is counting the cycles by which the house keeps time. A boy slides a strap through an old buckle that has lost its prong and uses a peg instead. He twists the leather tight around the peg, tucks the loose end back through and tests the hold with a tug that measures experience more than strength. He then checks the pack saddle pads again. They are stuffed with straw, but straw packs down and must be shaken loose. These small actions are the difference between a useful beast and a miserable one. Misery slows, it limps, it makes you impatient. Impatience makes mistakes. You have been taught to approach animals as you approach tools, with attention thriftily spent ahead of need. The fields call, but before you go you glance at the wall where a row of small terracotta faces watches. Not formal gods in marble grandeur, but house spirits shaped by fingers that are also good at pinching bread loaves and kneading clay around the hearth. One looks vaguely like Dionysus, ivy leaves pressed around the brow, a mouth turned upward as if remembering a joke too small to share. Another is simply a smooth bead pressed by a child's hand into an oval, and scratched with a stick for eyes, and a line for a mouth. Respect here is not a heavy matter. It is a habit, part of the same flow of motions by which you close the door gently, rinse the jug, coil the rope. You step out to the press site, a humble place that nonetheless carries the season's most concentrated effort. In Attica, many farmers tread grapes in shallow basins of plastered stone, linoi, set near the vines or inside a lean-to where the sun will not spoil what you have just pressed. The treading basin tilts a little, intentionally, so that must runs by a channel into a lower receptacle. You stand in the dry clean basin now and imagine feet that last autumn found their way in the cool mash without crushing the grape seeds, for bitterness is a penalty for haste. The press beam, those households that possess one, rests on uprights stained dark at hand height. A little above, a pin holds a hole where the beam can be shifted. The screw is a rare luxury, but the lever is common. You add weight with a balanced stone or with a team of men pulling a rope. A clever farmer borrows weight from neighbours and returns it by lending the donkey, or by keeping an eye on a child while a neighbour's wife takes a turn on the loom. The economy whole villages rely on is not coin. It is returnable favour. You walk the short ridge between vines and scrub and see. Because you look for it, the slow knife work of winter pruning extended along the terraces like music written in a script of cuts. The pruner leaves 1 or 2 spurs per vine according to the plant's vigour. He aims for the sweet point where next season's growth will be curtained enough to shade but open enough to dry. Downslope olive boughs, cut where they crossed and crowded, are stacked by size for later use. The finer ones will bind vines, the larger will season for fuel. Everything cycles into something else. Even the ashes from last year's hearth go back under the trees in a thin scatter of grey. A neighbour's voice drifts from the next plot, and because you are not in a hurry, you walk the boundary path to greet him. The path has been there longer than the living remember. At midpoint, a little herm standing on a squared stone bears a draped phallus and the worn suggestion of a face. Its shoulders show the outline of where a garland sat during a festival years ago. The clay beneath slightly brighter. People touch the herm as they pass, not because they fear a god's tantrum otherwise, but because hands have always done so, and it is difficult to break a motion that makes the day feel continuous with other days. Your neighbour speaks not of politics but of timing. He has heard that the dealer's clerk will be in the city earlier this coming market day. It may make sense to send goods down the road at dawn instead of after. Early means cool. Cool means amphorae travel without sweating. Dry ropes hold better knots, and knots that hold shake less on bad paving stones. You look at the donkey and count backward from that dawn to today's tasks. The pannier strap you repaired will hold, but a second strap shows cracked places and should not be asked to carry clay. The boy, hearing this, sprints back to the yard for the good awl and a length of leather cut earlier from an old sandal that had long become a pile of strips precisely for such a moment. You think again of the story's plain heart, a loned animal in a season when alone turns a day from thin to sufficient. Whether the god lent his own beast or a neighbour did so under the god's benevolent name is a difference without practical distinction. In a world where public cult and private necessity are stitched so closely, you cannot tell which seam belongs to which garment. Dionysus's donkey may simply mean the donkey that made the festival possible. Preparations for the rural Dionysia creep into the edges of work the way ivy creeps across a wall. First a tendril, then a cool shade. At the washing place, girls rinse ivy leaves in buckets and shake them on a reed mat to keep them fresh. The leaf oil slicks the skin lightly when it's tied as a wreath. A boy experiments with a reed pipe he will try to play in the procession. His fingers fumble holes, then find them long enough to coax a simple line. Behind a low fence, an older man unrolls a length of painted cloth for the skene, wiping soot from last year's jokes and patching where mice have admired the paste. No one rehearses loudly. The humour in these seasons is not so much in the performance as in having one, and setting aside a day when work moves at the speed of a donkey's deliberate hooves. But you do not mistake celebration for idleness. The festival is also a schedule keeper, reminding you when to clear ditches, when to scrape moss from the press stones, when to check the lintel beam where rain finds a way. Under the awning, a list is spoken more than it is written. Bring back more pitch. From the kiln near the coast for sealing amphorae. Set aside broken roof tiles to crush into drainage for a wet patch in the terrace. Barter a basket of olives for flax thread. Remind the neighbour to return the iron share he sharpened on his wheel. You hear how each item has a partner in the past and a partner in the future. Something borrowed earlier, something returned later, the ledger of the countryside kept in mouths and memory. Toward midday, the donkey goes back to the well. The way its head lifts when the bucket rises is exact, a calculation of when the sound will change from rope on pulley to water on wood. You watch the bucket spill into the stone basin. The animal lips the water with a soft sound like someone smoothing cloth. In a lull between gulps, you touch the animal's neck and feel heat and patience in equal measure. You decide to grease the sore-prone places with a little oil and a pinch of beeswax saved for this purpose. If you cannot afford a new strap before spring, you can at least slide the old one over the good skin. At the crossroads, late in the day, the dealer's boy returns, not with a cart this time, but with news. The city magistrates have cracked down on amphorae that leak and stain other merchandise in the market. Fines will be assessed if jars arrive in bad repair. This changes calculations. A jar that weeps a little is still good enough for your family's storage, but not for sale. You must choose which ones to send, and you must repitch two who seems a suspect. Pitching is tedious. Warm the resin in a clay pot above coals until it loosens, pour carefully into the jar's neck, roll the jar slowly on a bed of straw so the resin coats the inner shoulder and seals hairline faults. It is not difficult, but it makes the evening longer and the arms tired. Without the donkey's 2 earlier loads, you would not have the time or strength for it. You see the link clearly. An animal's back earlier is a better seal later. A better seal later is a fair price tomorrow. A fair price tomorrow is quietly warm bread next week. On the way home, you pass a field where goats have eaten too close to the roots. The herdsman offers a gesture of apology and a net bag of dung. Heavy, a decent price for the damage. No one calls it even because even rarely exists in a living village. Instead, you both recall other seasons when accidents shifted in the other direction. Balance is a long, slow labour. The donkey does not judge, it simply bears the bag, and your yard will hold a small stink this evening while the bag is emptied into the heap that will sleep under a cover of old reeds until rain softens it into usefulness. Night edges nearer, and you feel the day's end gathering like cloth being folded. In the house, a lamp hisses where a new wick has not yet learned how to sip oil without complaint. A thin stew almost ready on the hearth is flavoured with leeks, and last year's dried fish scraped of salt and soaked. The bread is coarse, the olives wrinkled, the figs late harvest sweet. The boy stares at the donkey through the doorway as if the beast were a visiting uncle who might tell a story. The woman laughs and tells him to fetch the small cloth with the neat hem. A practice piece, really, so the headband for the festival can be sewn tonight while hands are still calm. Conversation slides, as always, to weather and its cousins. The north wind will hold, someone says. The sea has been loud. A man who came from town earlier reports a rumour about a ship from Chios with good resin at a better price. Another says a cart overturned on the lower road because a driver hurried in dusk. Over and over, the moral returns in different clothing. Do not race the daylight with clay and hooves. Your eyes drift to the donkey where it drowses under the awning, lower lip drooping, eyes half shut. You see how the whole day's counsel could be summarised by the angle of that head. Now the festival is a handful of evenings away. Ivy wreaths sleep in a jar. A borrowed mask hangs from a peg. The pole for the procession lies on trestles, its end shaved smooth where it will sit in the bearer's hand. The skenny cloth smells of smoke and dye. A corner is patched with a piece of older fabric in which a faded vine wins nowhere in particular. Somewhere a man rehearses lines meant to make a village laugh. Jokes about sour wine, about a goat with too much opinion, about a donkey that knows the road better than its owner. You smile because you know that the jokes will be gentle, and their gentleness is the town's pact with itself. This is how neighbours practice criticism without breaking bone. You return to the yard once more to check the panniers. In one you lay a small bundle, spare rope, a pebbly whetstone, a folded piece of linen to wrap a jar mouth if the seal argues, a sliver of pitch hard enough to be useful in a pinch. In the other, you place the cloth bag that will later carry figs for friends met on the road. On the saddle, you tie the bell's thong so that the bell will not bounce and bruise the animal's ribs. You unknot, reknot, and stand back to listen. The bell gives a single consenting note. Before sleep you move through the house and yard, setting small things to rights. The interrupted tasks of a farm are dangerous. Better to close each day at a full stop. You hang the knife where hands will find it without looking. You cover the crater. You set the clay lid on the flour jar. You pinch out the lamp's flame with fingers wetted in a bowl that holds water for the purpose. It is not ceremony, and yet it is. The rhythm settles the mind, and a settled mind rises earlier and forgets less. Then you remember the tale, the one told in winter and at wells. The day the god lent his donkey, someone will say tomorrow or next winter, when a child asks why this family's vines did not fail when others did. Your answer, bound with the others, will include the right words. Attention to straps, a timely repitching of jars, a pause at noon to save strength for the evening seal, a willingness to move slow where the road becomes broken stone. But the phrase about the god will also be included because it gives permission to smile about practical grace. Names are tools too, they shape memory. A day worth remembering becomes easier to carry into another year when you hang it on a peg with a proper label. You lie down with that thought, and a last question waits at the threshold of sleep like a neighbour at the gate. If the donkey's patient back made the festival possible, and if the festival's slow order reminded everyone to tend straps and jars and ladders, then where exactly does the gift end and the work begin? Or are they, in the way of the old villages, the same thing walking under the same bell? You wake before the light, because festival days in the countryside begin not with song but with inventory. The lamp flame is coaxed from a coal, The room becomes a slow bowl of amber. You count quietly. 2 amphorae sealed yesterday, a bag of figs, a coil of rope, a little wedge of pitch in case a seam complains, the reed pipe the boy insists on carrying until nerves make him hand it to you. The donkey blinks in the doorway, breath fogging for a moment as warm house air meets the crisp out of doors. You run your palm along its back to feel for heat where heat should not be. The skin is even, the hair dry, the muscles ready. Today's loads are not heavy, but they are particular. The skeiny cloth must travel without rubbing against a jar mouth. The mask box must ride high so its corners do not notch the pannier weave. The pole for the procession must be balanced so that it does not tilt the saddle. You lay a folded reed mat under the mask box and bind it down with 2 turns of strap crossed like a simple letter. A bell's thong is retied to keep the bell from chafing the animal's breast. The boy loops his fingers through the leading rope, then relinquishes it when you look at him. He's proud, but he has also learned that pride is easier to carry when it's shared sparingly between hands that have done the thing before. The road gathers neighbours the way a shallow river gathers tributaries. From each yard 1 presence or 2 join. A man with ivy damp from last night's soak, a woman with a clay lamp cupped in her palm, a girl with a wreath of rushes because ivy makes her forehead itch. Someone has already eaten. Someone else carries bread in a cloth to be shared when the first resting place suggests itself. The smell is not yet wine. It is wool and oil and the cool of scrub that gives off scent when ankles brush it. The donkey's hooves pick the firmest part of the track because the animal remembers where the last rain chewed the surface into weakness. You let the rope lengthen and shorten with the rhythm of that memory. People will say later that the festival is the procession and the procession is the god, but most of it is pace. You look back and see how the column elongates on the slope and compresses where the track levels. You hear how talk rises where breath is easiest and declines where the path asks for attention. Near the boundary stone, a wreath is hung on the herm's neck, not perfectly. The man who ties it is tall and must bend. The bend makes the knot sit a little askew. No one adjusts it. Perfection is not the point. Continuity is. At the first halt, baskets are shifted hand to hand. The pole is walked forward to relieve the pair who have carried it. Your donkey draws even with the skeiner cloth, and for a moment the 2 touch. The boy gasps as if a taboo has been violated. But cloth against cloth is only cloth, and you smooth the moment with a word and a small adjustment. A strap creaks, and you kneel to check it. Leather shows a hairline crack where the awl holes from an older repair sit too close. You decide not to tempt it. From the coil at your belt you pull a second strap, thread it through, snug it down, and then run your thumb across the buckle to feel for a burr that would raise a sore later. You're not thinking of gods. You're thinking of afternoons in which a care taken before noon buys an hour of harmless silence at sunset. The shrine stands on a low rise that sees a wedge of valley and a sliver of sea. It is not grand. Its stones are ordinary, rubbed smooth by hands, licked by goats in dry years for salt, sealed at the seams with lime that cracks and is patched again each spring. 2 young plane trees offer shade, their leaves still small but promising in their green. A flat place under the trees has been swept clean with fennel brooms. The sweepings are piled to one side and will become kindling when the time for fire comes. Here the donkey's deliberate strength becomes service of a more public kind. The mask box is lifted and opened. The carved faces inside smell of glue and winter mildew that sun will chase away. The skeiny cloth is unrolled over the pole on trestles, tied at the corners, weighed at the lower hem with 2 stones that know this job by now as well as any actor does. Someone laughs because the painted vine curling across the upper right edge wanders into an old patch and emerges as a paler green, the past bleeding gently through the present. You are asked to shift the pole, then to hold it while a knot is redone. You obey the way you prune, without fuss, with your hands remembering angles better than your head remembers words for them. Wine appears, and with it the first public act that will later be summarised by private talk. It is not pouring for intoxication. It is careful tasting, a test that is also a blessing. A small measure is mixed in a crater, with spring water carried up from the well in a cool jar wrapped in a damp cloth. The mixing is itself a ritual of ratios. A man who boasts of drinking neat wine announces foolishness. A man who waters too much invites a joke at his expense. The bowl is held. The cup is dipped. The first sip is offered not to the priest nor to the loudest neighbour, but to the eldest woman present, who swallows and smiles with a small softening of her eyes. You think it is a good vintage, and also good that the jar seals held. Skill sits under blessing as a foundation sits under a house. There are words said that belong to the place. They are not precise in your memory because they do not need precision. They are said every year and reshape themselves around the season's small urgencies. Vines that survived wind are mentioned. A roof tile returned to its course after a storm. The name of a man who died at sea last winter, and whose family is reminded, quietly, by the naming, that the village does not forget. The donkey shifts weight and cocks a hind hoof. This too is continuity. The bell gives one thoughtful note when a hand brushes it. You think without irony that a god of wine is well served by a beast that refuses haste. After words, the practical recurs. The dealer's clerk has indeed come early to the city. A boy who ran down to the main road at dawn has the news. The 2 amphorae you brought to deliver to a neighbour for that sale are hoisted by 2 men, walked down the smoother side of the hill and set carefully on straw in a cart that creaks like a patient joint. A wax plug on one jar shows a hairline craze. You warm it between your palms, then press and smooth, then bind a thin band of linen around the neck to discourage dust and fingers. The cartman nods once, a formal courtesy that takes the place of coin for now. You trust the knowing of that nod because this is not the first year you have traded. Trust, like vines, is trained and pruned. The scanny carries the day for a while. Jokes are old, and that is why they are good. A goat that complains in a human voice about being overtaxed on thistles. A husband who fears his wife's temper more than Ari's is. A neighbour who scolds a fig tree for bearing all at once so the jars run out. Children laugh before the punchlines because they remember them, and because laughter is a permission slip to grow into. Your donkey receives a wreath of rushes over one ear and endures it. A boy tries the reed pipe. The tune stumbles twice, and then bounds along for 4 clean bars before plunging again. Women trade news about a loom-weight mould that will be shared once the clay is ready, about a dowry list that is more modest than last year yet sufficient. Men agree on the price of pitch and the condition of the lower road. Someone produces a small cake sweetened with must, and divides it with the measured generosity of a person who knows exactly how many mouths, and how much cake, and how long until bread. Midday lays a flat hand on the shrine stones and the field walls. The festival does not stop, it thins into shade. Your donkey is led to a wedge of quiet under the plane tree, and untacked long enough to rub the hair that lies under the saddle pads. You check. The girth and the back. No soreness presents. You tip water into a shallow basin. The animal drinks, then breathes with that steady bellows that marks its body as a kind of tool of air. You sit with your back against the same trunk and let your head find a place between 2 knots. The boy sleeps for 3 measured breaths and wakes, embarrassed. No one teases him. The day has no desire for sharpness. Work that could be deferred to a weekday slips in respectfully. A man examines a chipped sickle, and a neighbour with a stone smooths the edge with slow arcs. Someone asks you about your vines on the upper terrace, and whether the wind scoured them. You answer that the lower leaves were burnished, but the canes held. A woman points to the skeeny's patched corner, and says she has a better piece of cloth at home if someone will trade her a cup of stale wine to pour over a wasp sting when summer returns. These exchanges are the thin threads that make a net. You hardly feel them, and yet they keep you from falling through. Toward late afternoon, a last practical act remains. The mask box and the cloth must go home. The cart is left with its load. The road will be uneven in the lengthening light. You place the box again on the reed mat and bind it down. The cloth is rolled around the pole and tied so that it does not balloon in the evening breeze. The amphorae that belong to you and are not for sale are strapped into the panniers, not because you need them today, but because it is safer to move them now than tomorrow on a busy track. The donkey steps forward when you click your tongue, and the procession reforms in reverse. Laughter condensed, wreaths a little wilted, bell steady in its one-note insistence that time passes at the same speed going home as coming. On the slope, a small annoyance manages to be only small because you expected it. The repaired strap groans on a steep bit where the ground has been kicked loose by too many heels. You ease the donkey into the scrub to let the others pass, untie the strap, rethread it to take stress off the weak spot, and add a half hitch around the saddle frame as a backup. It is nothing, and also everything. Once, years ago, you ignored such a sound and spent a week nursing a sore that cost you 2 days of carrying and 1 amphora's neck. The lesson wrote itself into your hands, it is now a reflex rather than a memory. At the herm, the wreath is still cocked, as if the stone has learned to accept imperfection as the form of human devotion most likely to recur. The boy touches the stone belly and then his forehead, more habit than piety, and perhaps the same thing in a village where habit is the body's prayer. Dusk slides down the terraces like oil poured carefully from a jar. The air smells of bruised herbs and the iron tang of clay that has given up the day's heat. Home receives you by fitting itself back around your shape. The yard is a little messier than you left it. A chicken has discovered the midden's edge and investigated it with scholarly attention. The hearth coals are covered. The pot on the trivet answers a stir with a sound like a slow exhale. The donkey stands while you lift the mass box and slide it onto a shelf, cover the cloth with a shawl and untie the bell. You rub the animal's neck with the same small square of cloth you used in the morning. Consistency is its own kindness. You offer a handful of straw and a scoop of barley husks. The animal's teeth make a sound that says satisfaction without asking for poetry to name it. Then you do the thing that fixes the day into memory. You tell it back to yourself in order. This is not a ceremony, but it has the shape of one. You place small stones on a mental line, strap checked, seal smoothed, wreath cocked, bell steady, skenny patched, cup mixed, nod returned, strap retied, basin filled. You do not include every moment of laughter or every exchange of looks. Those will be carried by other throats in other yards. What you carry are the joints, the places where a day could have dislocated but did not. In that recounting there is room for the old sentence told at wells and winter hearths, the day the god lent his donkey. Whether a neighbour's hand on the halter or a painted story on a jar, first put the phrase in mouths does not matter. The phrase holds the shape of gratitude. It allows you to fold practical relief into communal memory without making anyone feel obliged to stand up and bow. You sit by the doorway with a cup that smells of resin and long autumn afternoons, and you think about the way this animal's steady back turned tasks into time. Without it, you would have carried the skene cloth yourself and reached the shrine already tired, and the mass box would have arrived with its corners bruised and ready to burst a seam. Without it, the amphorae that needed to be at the crossroads by dawn would have been a question rather than an answer. Without it, the boy would have had less to imitate and the neighbours less to exchange. A donkey is not a god, and yet its patience is the form in which the god's day arrived. You are asked perhaps by the boy or the neighbour at the fence when exactly the god's lending happened. You shrug in a manner that has practice in it. The years pile, vines thicken, men come and go, and yet this loan happens every time a beast is shared. A strap is tightened by someone who did not have to. A jar is sealed with a neighbour's last pinch of pitch and then paid back in figs when figs come in. The calendar cannot hold such small things. The village does. The god's name is a hook from which you hang a garland woven of such moments. It keeps them from slipping behind the oven where no one will find them again. Before sleep you return the day to order with the same small motions you used yesterday and will use tomorrow. Knife in its place, rope coiled, lamp pinched out, door bar slid. The donkey settles with a sigh that is not human, and yet speaks a language you share. Work done, back easy, belly comfortable, feet cool, eyes heavy. The bell now hangs from a peg under the awning. It is silent, and yet you hear it faintly because memory keeps just enough ringing to make tomorrow plausible. You go in, and in the steady dark of the house you think one more calm thought. The kind that arrives only when a day has been paced by 4 hooves and the villager's talk has held you upright rather than pushed you askew. You think of the markets beyond the city, farther than the cart will go, of ships that carry resin and oil and wine and return with pots and wool and saltfish, of pack animals stepping up and down the same indifferent slopes on islands and coasts you will never see. The world is larger than this dem, and yet it is built on the same small mercies repeated, until even the stone herms look content to bear witness. A chain of donkeys and carts and backs threads from your yard to places whose names you know, only because a neighbour's cousin once said them aloud. If a god's generosity must have a form, it is this, a patient sequence of bearable loads. You wonder, not restlessly, but with the curiosity of someone who knows sleep will come when the question has been named. What of this will carry forward beyond your own breath, and the boys? Perhaps only the habit of checking a strap before a slope. Perhaps the cadence of a bell that keeps men from forgetting that joy arrives at the speed of feet. Perhaps in a century someone will uncover a jar in a collapsed wall and run a finger over a smear of dark pitch and say that the man who sealed it knew his business. Perhaps, in a city you will not see, a painted scene of a vine-crowned figure on a long-suffering beast will make a stranger smile without knowing why. It is enough that such continuities exist. They are not grand, they are durable. You rise to close the door and hold for a moment in the threshold where house meets yard, where cool meets warmer, where light meets the dark that does not threaten. The donkey, already half asleep, shifts once and the bell on its peg answers with the lightest knock against wood. You nod to it as if to a neighbour at day's end, and because the thought has arrived and is worth setting down where you can find it tomorrow, you let the old question take its shape. In an age that prizes speed and spectacle, what quiet devices, animal, tool, habit, still carry our festivals, our markets, our household hopes along their patient routes, and would we notice them if they ceased to work for even a single day? Stone weights tick the warp, wool breathes across the frame, a goddess teaches by silence, threads remembering fields, households learning patience one shuttle at dusk. You enter an Athenian house not through its stories, but through its fibres. The courtyard is bright, the rooms around it are shaded and spare. The floor is tamped earth, the air smells of olive oil, ash and something, faintly sweet that proves to be lanolin, wool's own memory of the sheep. A warp-weighted loom stands against a wall exactly where light falls without glare, a long rectangle of uprights and crossbars tilting slightly toward you. Clay weights hang in even ranks at the bottom, 30, 40, perhaps more, each the size of your palm, each pierced through, each glazed here and there by a thumb that has smoothed it 1,000 times while setting the day in order. If you listen for divinity, you will not hear a trumpet. You will hear the click of a heddle rod finding its place, the whisper of a weaver's sword beating weft tight, the small chime of a loom weight tapping its neighbour when the shed is opened. Athena is praised in speeches and in stone, but the city honours her most faithfully in rooms like this, where cloth is coaxed from twist and tension, where a household's future depends on regular rectangles that drape, wrap, line, and bind. You begin at the beginning, fibre. In Attica, wool is the backbone. Flocks pastured on the low hills and fallow fields produce fleeces that vary from coarse to lively fine. Shepherds pick burrs from the locks with a patience matched only by the weaver who later teases curls into alignment. The year itself is a carder. Spring shearing yields wool that remembers green. Autumn shearing, when done, is thicker, a winter promise. In baskets beside the loom, you see tufts that have been washed in warm water with ash lye, rinsed, dried in shade so sun does not scorch softness. Olive oil, a drop rubbed between fingers, tames flyaways as the distaff receives its easy cloud. The distaff is simple, a stick, sometimes forked, sometimes plain, with wool wound upon it like a small captured wether. In the other hand, the spindle, a shaft with a whirl near its base, clay or stone or wood, weight chosen by feel. A twist imparted by thumb and forefinger sets the spindle whirling, gravity draws it down, and twist races up the drafted fibres to make a line, thin or stout according to use. You watch the drafter's hand regulate like a cautious banker. Too much fibre and the yarn will be lazy, too little, and it will break. The spindle fills, the weaver winds off, skeins accumulate like quiet coin. Not every household spins all it weaves, not every house weaves all it wears, but most houses do enough of both to keep dependents away from doors. You see skeins sorted by intention, pale for cloth that will be worn near the skin, coarser for sacks, a few steely greys earmarked for a cloak that must endure wind. Beside them, a small bowl of dye stuff, madder root shaved thin for red that runs from rose to rust, Weld's dried spikes for clear yellow, stale wine mixed with iron scrap to bring a serviceable black. Saffron is rare and reserved. Purple from Murex is rarer still, a cost counted not in coin alone but in the long stink of shells smashed and boiled by men who work far from women's rooms. True blues are uncommon in Attica's common households. When they appear, they come by exchange and distance, and are used sparingly as lines that say, "Someone made a good bargain." The warp-weighted loom is a teacher of gravity. Two stout uprights fix into feet at the floor, framed by a top crossbar. From this bar hangs the warp, the long taut threads that will become the length of the cloth. Each warp end descends to a small bundle of threads tied around a weight. The weights are not decoration. They are the loom's consent to the earth. They keep tension constant as yarn relaxes with humidity, and the day's work descends inch by inch. A shed rod divides alternate warps. A heddle rod gathers the ones in between, each linked by a heddle loop tied from fine cord. Lift the heddle rod. A clean opening appears. Pass the weft through with a shuttle or with fingers. Drop the rod. Lift the shed rod. Pass back. Beat with a sword. Wooden, smooth, sometimes bone, until the weft lies tight against its predecessor. Repeat, steady as breathing. A woman, call her Philia if you like names that mean love, works now with a posture learned young. Feet set, one knee slightly forward, back straight so hours do not punish. She is not alone. A sister minds the skeins, a child plucks at a loom weight and receives a light rebuke without heat. An older neighbour brings news that the potter on the corner road has finished a new set of weights with neat stamp marks for counting. Work here is communal without spectacle. The oikos, household, thrives by cooperation unremarkable enough to escape poetry, except when poets want to praise Athena for more than spears. Tabby weave, simple over, simple under, dominates. It produces a fabric honest and durable, its strength lying in balance. Twills exist, yes, but more often in imported blankets or in households where a curious weaver has learned by imitation. Attica's staple is the tabby that takes dye well, folds neatly, and survives washing without sulking. Patterns are introduced with colour bands in the weft, with checks achieved by alternating coloured warps and wefts, with selvage stripes that say, "This was woven by that house," a signature without script. On occasion, a weaver floats a weft over several warps to paint a small motif, a meander, a leaf. But such luxuries take time most cannot often spare. You note the economics folded into this rectangle. A peplos, simple square garment, requires width, not just length. The loom's span matters. In smaller rooms, weavers make two narrower cloths and seam them. In houses blessed with space, a wide loom produces a garment without seam down the side, a small comfort that keeps wind from finding its way. A chiton asks for lighter cloth, a hymation. The wrap that answers cold or modesty prefers a heavier hand. Each piece consumes hours, days, and the hours themselves consume oil. Lamps must be lit in winter afternoons, wicks trimmed, soot managed. Cloth is thus debt and savings. Both a chest of linens is a dowry as persuasive as coin. A family that can give a daughter 3 good lengths bears witness to foresight and fields tended without panic. The city's calendar enters the room by way of the loom most publicly in the Panathenaea, when the peplos for Athena Polias is presented. Small each year at the lesser festival, great every 4 years at the greater. The Augustinae, the workers, maidens chosen and guided by older women, prepare that sacred cloth, woven with the story of the goddess's victory over giants. A myth placed on fabric as if to say, our triumphs travel in useful forms. That peplos is grander than what you see here. Its dye richer, its narrative woven by hands that have trained long. But the household loom is cousin to the city's. The same motions compose both piety and pyjamas. You ask because history asks how skill is transmitted, not by lecture, by hand. A girl is given a spindle before she's given a story to memorise. She learns twist before myth, draft before genealogy. The first yarn is lumpy and dear. A mother may tie it around a bag for herbs where unevenness does no harm. The first weft rows are too tight. The cloth bows and protests. A neighbour shows how beating asks for firmness without anger. The first warp is crossed. The shed refuses to open cleanly. An aunt lifts the heddle rod and shows how to clear the tangle with a comb and patience. Mistakes become household objects, straps for bundles, covers for jars, until errors thin and usefulness thickens. Men enter this room too, but briefly, to carry a new beam, to drill a clean hole for a heddle bar, to fetch a fresh pot of ashlie from the hearth. The room does not forbid them, it simply does not revolve around them. In a city that values public speech and the clash of ideas in the agora, it is easy to forget that most Athenians live private lives where steady skill beats brilliance. The loom is the private city's assembly. Decisions are made, Cloth for winter, sacks for the coming olive harvest, a gift for a neighbour's childbirth, a funeral shroud. The answers ripple outward as surely as votes ripple through the nicks, but with less dust and fewer gestures. Finishing is its own discipline. When a length comes off the loom, it is not yet a garment. It is washed again to set the threads and invite them to lie closer. In some households, fulling is done lightly at home with ashley, trampling by foot in a basin. Heavier fulling is the realm of professionals who mix urine, clay and movement to toughen cloth, but that cost is saved for cloaks that will see weather. Nap may be raised with teasels or with careful scraping, then sheared down with a knife to a velvety discipline. Edges are hemmed with linen thread where wool would abrade. Corners reinforced where pins will fasten garments. The cloth is then folded along the warp's run and laid in a chest with laurel leaves to deter moths, and a memory to deter suddenly. Generous lending. The dyes return because colour is not merely vanity. A narrow purple line near a selvage can convert an ordinary wrap into a statement when visiting kin. A saffron border on a girl's shift whispers festival without shouting coin. A black tunic worn crisp says mourning that is dignified but not indulgent. Mordants, the salts that fix colour, matter, and are husbanded carefully. Alum if you have it, but more often tannins from oak galls or vinegar reboiled with iron. The pot for dyeing is not the pot for stew. Dyes teach this lesson once, and then the household never forgets. You see coloured strainers hung from a peg, their mesh stained. You see a stick, only a stick, marked by years of stirring pigments into the day. Athena's lesson, the one later poets make famous in stories of contests and punishments, rarely shouts in such rooms. It is instead a habit she teaches by example. Measure, warps are counted, weft passes are counted. Hours are counted not to hurry them away, but to be certain each one has done its work. You hold the beater sword, feel its edge, not sharp like a blade meant to cut, but keen enough to press threads into alignment. With it, the weaver makes order visible. The goddess who is said to have invented the chariot and the ship's prow also commends the calm that keeps a line straight. If a city's greatness is partly its ability to proportion, to measure, to restrain, the loom is the school where proportion first feels like comfort rather than constraint. Trade comes in quietly. A cousin from Euboea brings a small keg of darker wool. A neighbour's brother, a potter, barters new loom weights stamped with a tiny owl for a length of sackcloth. A travelling dyer's apprentice sells a thimble of stronger allume at a price that makes everyone raise brows and then pay anyway. In the agora, bolts of imported linen tempt those with coin or with dowries backed by silver. Linen, cool and fine, is valued for tunics and undergarments. It asks different hands, different heddles. Some houses keep a second loom for it. Most adapt, tying a finer heddle rod, setting weights closer, learning not to beat quite so hard. Athenian households are conservative, but not stubborn. They add new tools to old rooms if those tools can be taught to behave. Outside this room, the year moves with its own insistence. Sheep must be walked to pasture. Olives must be picked with care not to bruise. Grapes must be treaded before they forget their balance of sugar and acid. In harvest seasons, the loom rests more often. In winter, it is the house's heart. Donkeys stand, as in yesterday's story, and carry panniers filled with wool or with finished cloth to the market road. The connection between animal and tool is not sentimental. It is practical. A bale protected from drizzle by a waxed cloth arrives sellable. One damp at the edges invites mould and disgrace. You pass the beater sword to the woman and step outside for a moment just, to notice how the courtyard light makes a checkered pattern of reed shadows on the tamped earth. Warp and weft everywhere once you learn to see them. The law touches cloth chiefly in dowry and inheritance. Lists are made, sometimes on papyrus, more often in witnessed memory, of 3 good blankets, 2 peploy, 4 tunics, and household linens. These items anchor promises. A marriage begins with folded cloth as insurance against bad seasons and bad behaviour. Courts will later argue over amphorae of oil and plots of vines. A textile chest will be opened to count contents against those lists. There is nothing romantic about these inspections, and yet there is something honourable in the city's willingness to treat women's labour as capital, even when it refuses their voices in assembly. Not everything woven is worn. The house eats cloth in surprising ways. Wicks cut from old rags, strainers for wine, sieves for flour, covers for jars against dust, Swaddling bands, shrouds. Sacred spaces ask for cloth too, bands for temple statues, hangings for a small country shrine, a new ribbon for a herm whose wreath sits crooked all year. You begin to understand that the city is not marble and argument alone. It is also the quiet multiplication of threads into durable surfaces that remember hands after those hands are gone. In the corner, a small shrine, no taller than your knee, holds a terracotta figurine of a woman with a rolled cloth in her lap. It is not Athena in armour. It is perhaps Athena again, worker, or perhaps just a generic house goddess with the city's favoured face. A sprig of olive lies across the base. A smear of honey has dried into amber. The weaver touches the figurine's head with the back of her fingers before she takes up the sword again. It is not worship as spectacle. It is acknowledgement that some skills are too daily to bear trumpeting and yet too necessary to be left unblessed. By late afternoon, the cloth has descended the width of Philia's palm, measured, marked by a little charcoal line on the selvage so she can tell tomorrow how far today truly travelled. She ties a neat knot at the weft's end, sets the heddle rod to rest, and covers the warp with a square of linen to keep dust from nesting in the shed overnight. The loom weights hang still for a moment, as if listening, and then bump once softly, like neighbours confirming a plan. A child is allowed to lay a hand flat against the fabric. The child says it feels like summer clouds. The adults say nothing, but someone smiles. The room empties and fills again with other tasks. Bread set for tomorrow, a lamp trimmed, a basket of carded wool covered. You look once more and try to name what you have learned. That Athens is kept alive by measured acts. That a goddess's favour arrives as a habit before it arrives as a myth. That a city's pride in ideas does not eclipse its dependence on rectangles beaten tight by patient arms. That dowry and dignity can be folded and stored and then unfolded and worn. That a loom is a map of how strength and softness negotiate space daily. A last detail catches you before you leave. On the underside of a loom weight, a scratched owl and 3 dots. The house's mark, an accounting trick. The weight has been dropped and repaired. A smear of fine clay seals a chip. The thumbprint there is permanent. You understand how such a small trace turns anonymous labour into something signed. How clay remembers what parchment forgets. How a city's memory is not only in inscriptions 10 feet high, but also in the nicknames for a favourite beater sword, and the way a distaff leans where its owner always leaves it. You step out into the courtyard and the sky above is a pale cloth being dyed slowly peach by evening. The house breathes, slow, orderly, sufficient. The loom waits. Athena's lesson waits with it, as patient as weights on a cord. Count what matters, tension what must be held, beat only as hard as is needful, and stop each day at a place you can find again tomorrow. If the goddess were to ask a question in such a room, she would not ask about fame, she would ask about measure. And so you leave with a question in your pocket as modest as a spindle whorl and as heavy. When a city is woven from 1,000 private rectangles, what unravels first when measure fails? The cloth on the loom, the promises in the dowry chest, or the temper in the hands that hold the heddle rod? You return to the loom the next day at a different hour, because the room's truth changes with light. Morning makes the warp gleam, afternoon makes the weft show, evening folds the whole rectangle into a gentler agreement. Philia, keep her name if it helps you count, has already checked the warp's tension by the oldest measure. 2 fingers pressed against a thread to feel the give. She has dampened her palm lightly at the water jar so loose fuzz will lie down. She has rubbed a breath of oil on the beater's edge so it will kiss the fabric and not tug. Habit seats itself before thought. The loom remembers her height and reach. She remembers its small sulks and how to smooth them. Today's work carries more counting than yesterday's, because bands of colour will be added. Nothing showy. 2 narrow stripes near the selvages to make a household signature. She has set aside weft yarns dyed in weld and madder, both modestly used so the cloth will wear as everyday dress, not festival. The yellow must not shout. The red must not bleed when the cloth is washed. She has mordanted the skeins, oak gall for the yellow, alum if she can spare it for the red, and rinsed until the water runs clear. The dye pot sits outside the room, under the awning, because dyes are honest but clingy. They remember any pot that remembers stew. You watch her lay in the first coloured pick. 2 wefts travel together, ground and band, then separate again so the band lies true, not drifting toward the centre. The beat is firmer for the band to keep its edge from wandering, then lighter so the ground does not squeeze it into a string. A child reaches to touch the bright line and is told to wait until the pick is set. Waiting is part of the lesson, and not only for children. Most of the city's durable things happen at the speed of patience. The loom is a school, but it is also a ledger. Cloth moves between households as debt and gift. In the next room, a chest holds 2 good peploi folded along their length, wrapped in linen to keep moths from finding the wool's taste. On their edges, narrow borders show a different hand, work done long ago by Philia's mother. The borders are not elaborate. They are repeating checks, just enough to make them recognisable in the street without needing to speak names. If the family lends one to a neighbour for a funeral, it will be returned clean and with a small parcel of olives or a pot of honey in thanks. If it is not returned, witnesses will have the courtesy to say so softly, and a quiet obligation will be set in motion. No bailiff comes for cloth. Memory comes, and memory keeps better accounts than ink. Outside this room, the city's economy of fibres continues, and you follow its line because Athena's lesson lives as much in exchange as in manufacture. In the agora, a row of stalls under awnings offers yarn and cloth in the measured shade. The sellers are not all citizens. Metics, resident foreigners, keep shops, freed people assist them, enslaved women sit on low stools with baskets of spindle whorls, loom weights, and combs for carding. A man from Boeotia speaks of a coarser wool that takes dye stubbornly but wears like a promise. A woman from the islands shows linen finer than most Athenians see, its threads like hair, its sheen like watered light. Coins change hands, more often promises and notes do. The city's official measures hang nearby, rods and jugs stamped with marks so sellers and buyers can point to authority when hands disagree. Fullers work at the edge of all this, men up to their knees in tubs, pressing cloth with feet and with paddles, turning lumpy fabrics sure by a mixture of lye, clay and labour. Their yards smell of ammonia and ash. Their hands are rough. You do not disdain them. Your winter cloak will be better for their attention. They beat error out of cloth. They thicken and finish it. They raise nap and shear it down to something that resists wind. A good fuller returns cloth with corners still square and seams unpuckered. A poor one will be named as such, and his name will travel faster than his feet. The city enforces some standards, waits honest, measures honest, but reputation travels farther than law. Back at the loom, Philia pauses to fix a cross in the warp. Crosses happen when a single warp thread slips its heddle and climbs into the wrong shed. If not corrected, the fabric will carry a thin fault, a ladder waiting for a toe to snag. She unloops the heddle carefully, passes the thread back with a comb's tail, and ties a fresh heddle from a cord she keeps wound around her wrist for such errands. You admire that wrist. The cord has left a pale groove there, permanent as a ring. Tools mark us, gently or not. The city's men carry calluses from oars, plough handles, spear shafts, pens. The city's women carry grooves from cords, smooth thumb bowls in beater swords, the memory of weight in forearms that have steadied warp beams. When a neighbour steps in, the room becomes council. She brings a spindle filled with yarn the colour of dry earth. Her sheep grazed different pasture. The wool took the dye differently. They talk not of tragedy and comedy, but of twist and handle. The neighbour's yarn is a little harder, spun tighter. Philia rubs it, listens to how it squeaks against itself and nods. Hard weft for sacks, softer for tunics. They agree to swap 2 skeins each, a little experiment. If the cloth behaves well, they will repeat. If not, no one will be offended. Trials and errors are part of households, not only of workshops. The goddess of measure tolerates trial when it is done with respect for the cloth. You widen your attention to the house's larger pattern. A ledger, if the household keeps one, lives in talk and in small marks. Scratches on the undersides of a loom weights, ticks on the beam's end, a charcoal line on a wall that counts days until the oil jar must be refilled in the market. The men who speak in courts about drachmas and talents sometimes forget these quieter accounts, but the city would fail without them. A week's work at the loom equals a month's bread when traded well. A dowry of cloth cushions, a marriage when harvests air. A surplus of sacks this winter will be a cushion in summer when olives swell and need carrying. You look outward again, because Athens' cloth does not end at its walls. Traders bring wool from Thessaly thick as lamb fat. They carry back cloth from Attica with borders neat enough to fetch fair price on the islands. On ships, bales are wrapped in sailcloth tied with a rope that has seen salt. Within each bale a list is written on a potsherd and tucked in a slit so a buyer can tell which house wove what. A pack donkey, of the kind you met in the last story, carries these bales from the weaver's yard to the wharf. Hooves, rope, cloth, coin. Athena and Dionysus share a long acquaintance with logistics. The loom pauses at midday. Bread and olives, watered wine, a wedge of cheese, a fig if the jar yields. The room cools as the house's shadow lengthens across the courtyard. Philia turns the cloth edge and checks the selvage where Snag likes to begin. She pinches a stray thread flat with spit and thumb. She snips a weft's tail clean and presses it down so it will lie, invisible and obedient, under the next picks. You hear, in these small acts, the voice of a city that prefers moderation to surprise. The loom is Athens' argument against disorder. Lessons continue in details that sleep in corners until you look for them. A spare heddle rod leans behind the loom, hazel, straight-grained, chosen because it warps little in damp. A beam end bears a ring of soot where a lamp was hung last winter when the day died too early. Someone has since moved the lamp so soot won't fall on the warp. 2 loom weights differ by a fraction. Their owner scratched a second dot on the heavier one so she can pair them. The broken weight has been repaired with slip and patience. The repair shows but offends no one. Necessity shapes taste. The repaired looks honest, and honesty is comely. Philia's household does not exist alone. A lane away, another loom works linen. You visit, because comparison teaches. Linen asks a different hand. Warp ends finer, heddles closer, beat lighter. The weaver, older, with a gaze that can find errors at arm's length, lifts the heddle and passes the shuttle like a sparrow darting through reeds. Linen is loud when beaten too hard. It crackles and complains. Wool is forgiving. Linen remembers offences. The room smells cleaner. Fewer oils in the fibre, but harsher in another way, because flax retting done elsewhere leaves behind a ghost. The linen cloth gleams, good for summer, good for undergarments. The woman shows you a small trick. A damp cloth, pressed ahead of the fell line to coax fibres to lie. Tricks like this do not enter decrees. They pass from hand to hand, with a nod to Athena Ergane and an unspoken agreement that good work deserves quiet pride. You pass a fuller's yard on the way back. Cloth hangs like wet clouds on wooden racks. 2 men stomp in a vat singing under their breath to keep measure. Another rakes nap with hooked teasels. A boy brings buckets of water and empties them into a trough. The master inspects a length returned from a customer. He runs a palm against the nap, checks that the cloth lies true, flips a corner and shakes it to listen for weight. He points to a faint streak, uneven dye, shrugs, and notes aloud that the dyer, not the fuller, will be blamed for that. Trades interlock and so do their reputations. If a cloth fails, everyone will know who failed first. At home, Philia begins the second band. The first has dried. The yellow sits well. The red waited its turn and now carries the same width, counted by picks rather than by inches. Children are allowed to count the picks, tapping the beater each time. It trains both patience and numbers. A cousin arrives with news about the Panathenaic peplos, how the Augustini have set the first figures at the bottom border, how an older woman corrected a too loose beat before it showed on the front. The city's grand cloth is distant and near at once, distant in prestige, near in method. Every household that beats weft tight contributes in spirit to the peplos in the citadel. The household schedule asks for one more enterprise today, a length of sackcloth for the olive harvest. It does not need beauty, it needs density and strength. Philia knots leases to mark the spacing for a coarser warp. She speaks the numbers as she counts, the counting itself a charm against future error. A boy brings the heavier weights. They thud into place, each a small promise of tension that will not sway at the first jolt. The shuttle for sackcloth is different, wider, heavier, with a groove that accommodates a thicker weft. When she passes the first rows, the beat is heavy, and the cloth answers with a sound like a fist pressed into dry earth. Tools teach ears as well as hands. Even here in Utilities Province, measure governs. If the sackcloth selvages curl, olives will slide. If the corners are weak, ropes will tear them. If the weave is too tight, the cloth will not breathe and will sour fruit. The right compromise, dense but not airless, strong but not stiff, cheap in time but not false in strength, is calm wisdom, not genius. Athena's lesson is modest and exact. Find the mean that endures. In the late light, the room plays a last trick. The sun rakes across the warp and shows errors you missed when the light was overhead. A faint diagonal shadow reveals that 3 picks are slightly tighter than their neighbours. Philia marks the spot with a charcoal dot on the selvage. Tomorrow she will soften the area with a damp cloth and a slower beat. Cloth forgives if corrected soon. If you wait, it sets its mind. The city's laws can be like that too, but today you're content to learn from fibre rather than from men. Before she covers the loom, Philia inspects the tools. The beater's edge is smooth, the heddle cords are not fraying. The warp beam's pegs are set firmly. The loom feet sit square on small stones, so damp does not creep up into the wood. She slips a sliver of wax along the shuttle's groove. She takes a moment to rub the loom weight's cords between her fingers. If one feels rough, she will flip it so the roughness sits on the weight rather than on the warp. These are small compass points. They keep a household ship from drifting. Evening brings counsel from beyond the family. A neighbour's husband returns from the agora with talk that the price of a loam has risen. Merchants say a shipment was delayed in bad weather off Cape Sunion. That will pinch dyers and anyone wanting clear yellows and reds to hold. Households adjust. More tannin mordanting. More patience with colours that will fade to honest browns. A metic woman who keeps a stall of second-hand garments says a cache of well-kept tunics from a closed estate will be for sale. Philia considers whether to save time by buying one for a cousin's dowry and spending that time on sacks instead. Time is a currency. Cloth is how you bank it. The house lights a lamp, a wick cut from old linen drinks oil from a small terracotta bowl. Soot licks the wall. Someone moves the lamp and wipes the spot with a rag dipped in vinegar water. Philia threads a needle with linen thread too, then the edge of a small towel, because handwork at dusk calms the mind in a way a loom's thunder cannot. Children are set to weaned warp ends for tomorrow on a small frame. They complain and then find the rhythm. A visitor sets a sprig of olive on the little figurine in the corner and murmurs a name. Athena, yes, but perhaps also her own mother's, because gratitude tends to collect and flow through the nearest channel. You sit and hold the day in a measure of your own. What did you see? That colour is rationed not by meanness but by prudence. That repairs can be beautiful when truth is valued above show. That trades depend on one another. Shepherd, spinner, dyer, weaver, fuller, seller, wearer. That a goddess of wisdom is honoured not only in stone on a high hill, but in the number of heddle loops tied before breakfast. That the city's idea of justice might be learned in a loom room. Equal tension, even opportunity for each thread to do its work. Correction done early and without rage. Tomorrow we'll ask other things. Perhaps a rush to finish sackcloth before olives darken. Perhaps a decision about selling the narrower bolt to a cousin or keeping it for winter. But tonight you let a single question settle like a cover over the warp. When prices shift, when ships are late, when hands grow tired, which part of this measured chain should bend first? The colour in the border, the fineness of the weft, the number of sacks promised? Or is the wiser path to adjust something less visible, like the pace of the beater and the length of the day? You return to the loom on a morning edged with chill and clarity, the kind of air that makes threads look slightly sharper where they cross. The house is awake but quiet, bread rising near the hearth, a pot lid tapping now and then as steam negotiates its escape. Footsteps measured to the hour's restraint. Philia has uncovered the warp. The banded selvages lie straight. The ground cloth holds to its calm plan. She runs 2 fingers down the fell line the way a builder runs 2 fingers along a plumb string. It is a gesture of confirmation rather than discovery. You recognise the comfort in it. The day has a track, and you are on it. Today asks for finishing, never the glamorous part of any craft, and always the part that decides whether labour will earn its rest. The cloth is nearly the length she counted for a peplos, not for a sacred one destined for the citadel's display, but for a garment that will bear washing, oil, and ordinary days with grace. The last hand's breadth is where errors like to hide. Philia has left it for morning light. She tightens the heddle loops that have stretched with yesterday's humidity, lifts the shed, passes the shuttle, beats once, twice, with a breath between. If you listen carefully, you can tell that the beat is tempered, a fraction lighter, as if the cloth itself were being landed rather than pursued. A girl you have begun to think of as Philia's daughter, though you need no names for tasks, arrives with a small bowl of water and a scrap of linen. She dampens a place where yesterday's diagonal tightness showed, the trouble you marked with a charcoal dot at the selvage. Moisture persuades threads to loosen their private quarrels. Philia beats there with the patience that solves small problems without beginning larger ones. After 3 passes, the fault relaxes from line to memory. The child smiles as if she had trimmed a long nail cleanly. An annoyance will not catch on anything later. These are the satisfactions that keep patience solvent. At the foot of the loom, weights nudge one another and rest. You turn one over in your hand and see again the scratched owl and 3 dots. The weight bears an old chip, neatly mended. It bears the polish of touch. It bears the weight of the city in small, the same way a coin does. The difference is that this weight stays at home, ensuring value rather than exchanging it. You replace it and think about the quiet infrastructure that never travels and yet moves everything else. The last picks settle into place. Philia speaks the number softly. Habit, not magic. She ties off the weft with a neat surgeon's knot learned from a cousin who ties fishing lines the same way. The warp cords are loosened from the upper beam one by one. A smell of dust and wool lifts, the odour of work becoming object. When the cloth comes off the loom, everyone breathes a little differently. It lies across forearms heavier than it looked while vertical. Wool remembers gravity differently when it becomes a surface instead of a promise. Finishing begins, as finishing always does, with water. Not the fuller's yard today, this is not a cloak asking for thickening, but the house's own basin, a broad ceramic bowl that has seen feet and linens, and the occasional child washable to the waist. Warm water mixed with a little ash lye cleanses the last oils and helps the thread settle closer. The cloth is submerged and lifted, pressed, not wrung. Wringing is for laundry, and laundry is less forgiving. It is rinsed, then pressed again between flatboards the way a scribe presses sheets, to keep a curl from dominating a page. The house knows a dozen ways to persuade a thing to accept its best shape. A breeze helps. Athens is kind that way. 2 pegs on the courtyard wall hold a rod. The cloth is draped not by its corners but across the rod's width, so the selvages do not stretch. Philia smooths the surface with a flat palm. The child smooths, and then looks to see whether her smoothing looked like smoothing or like play. Philia nods once. The child finds a rhythm in that nod she will remember when no one reminds her. While the cloth dries, the room shifts to the work you rarely hear about in speeches. Edge-making. Hems prevent waste. Wool may not fray like linen, but corners and edges still ask for calm restraint. Philia threads a needle with linen thread, the humble choice that spares wool from rubbing on itself. She begins a small running stitch that bites the fold and returns, a path measured by eyes, not by a ruler. If you hold your breath, you can see how this stitch is the city's ideal made small. Order without fuss, consistency without tyranny. You notice something else. Repair is planned before damage. Philia cuts a little square of the same cloth from the waist at the warp's beginning, those few inches woven to set tension. She folds the square and puts it away in a pottery jar on a shelf where a second square from a cloth woven last year already rests. These will patch knees or corners if some future day surprises them. Patches sewn from the same clothware with the garment. The city's thrift is not meanness but continuity. By midday, the cloth is dry enough to accept the iron's ancestor, a smooth river stone warmed near the hearth and passed along the cloth surface while covered with a damp linen. It is not the flattened gleam of later centuries, it is a disciplined calm that helps folds remember their places. The child tries. The stone is heavier than it looks. She sets it down carefully and shakes her hand. It tingles. She looks at Philia's forearms and understands a different kind of strength than the one boys boast about after running in dust. You step away for an errand broader than the room, a walk to the fuller's yard with another piece, a cloak that needs thickening before winter demands it. The yard smells as it smelled yesterday. Sharp, useful, unpleasant only to people who have the luxury of finding labour's aroma offensive. Cloth hangs like a ranked fog. The fuller takes Philia's cloak, runs a hand against the nap to see how it lies, nods, and names a return day. He knows this family's work. They know his. No receipt passes between. Reputation is the ink that does not fade. On the way back, you cut through the agora. Talk withers and bursts here like flame in a draught. A citizen recites something about a decree concerning weights. A metic sells imported linen from a bale, with a painted mark you recognise because you saw its like in the weaver's room. A shopkeeper argues that alum has not, in fact, risen too dear, and holds out his stamped measure to prove honesty. Somewhere a boy knocks a staff against a stone in boredom. The city's texture is different from the loom rooms, but it is not opposite. Both rely on counting and trust. Both fail when those thin strands break. Back home, the cloth is folded across the courtyard table. Philia measures the length against a string knotted for her daughter's height. The string's knots are a household ledger for growth. A neighbour arrives with her own length, narrower and coarser, meant for sacks. They compare edges without envy. One has neatness like running water, the other has tenacity, a strength born from thicker weft. Each is right for its aim. They trade a few moralities without moralising. Use linen thread in the hems, keep vinegar, water to wipe soot. Turn the loom feet on stones if the floor grows damp. Do not lend the beater sword except to someone who will return it clean. A city is a long conversation about care. You begin to think outward again, because a finished cloth does not end at a chest. It enters life. This peplos will be pinned at the shoulders with bronze fibulae, perhaps plain, perhaps with a little granulated decoration if a cousin is generous. In summer, it will be worn alone. In spring and autumn, with himation. It will go to the well, to visits, to sacrifices, to funerals where black is signalled by a crispness of line rather than turbidity of dye. It will be washed, it will be mended. In a decade, it may be set aside as a shroud if the family needs one. Cloth is an itinerary as much as an object. The afternoon brings a visitor whose presence resizes the day, an older woman who once served as Augustine for the Panathenaic peplos. Her hands have a different history, less time at the press of household necessity, more time at the exacting edges of civic pride. The motions rhyme. She lifts the housemaid cloth, runs a thumb along the selvage, peels back the hem to look at the stitch, then sets it down as if she had just weighed a thought in a balance, and found it not only equal, but good. She says little. She does not need to. A single sentence suffices. Athena would wear this to work. No one laughs. It is the highest praise in a city that pretends to love brilliance more than steadiness, and in truth relies on steadiness more. There is still the matter of storage. The chest is opened. The interior smells of laurel leaves and wool's own whisper. The new cloth is folded with attention to the bands so that they do not crease in a way that will crack dye. Beneath it lies an older cloth repaired twice. Beside it, a linen length intended for summer. Under both, household linens that know the maps of table and bed. Philia lifts each, not to display but to remember what exists. Households that forget their own stores become poor by surprise. A line of black pebbles at the chest back marks which pieces will be pulled out first, which held for guests or for need. Inventory is wisdom that does not require a stylus. Evening draws in as steadily as a warp. A lamp is lit. A plain terracotta, olive oil filling its shallow belly, wick trimmed to a mild tongue of flame. The soot will be wiped tomorrow. The stone that smoothed the cloth cools on the sill. The child, who has done her share, is given a simpler task. Winding excess weft onto a small stick to be kept as mending yarn. She winds, then smooths the wound thread with a palm, then tucks the end under. She does not know yet that this small habit will matter 20 years from now when her hands find the same stick without thinking. You sit with the day and let it array itself like a shuttle's passes. The morning's correction of a tight diagonal, the weight-scratched owl, the finishing. Water's temperature judged by wrist. The warmed stones pass along damp linen. The fuller's nod. The neighbour's counsel. The Augustine's praise. The chest's laurel. The lamp's reasonable light. If you were asked to write a victory song for Athens, you suspect it would sound more like this room than like a trumpet. It would count. It would measure. It would praise repairs. It would teach hands how to stop without wasting and start without fear. Outside, a donkey passes, its bell offering a single dry note to the lane. It reminds you of the previous story and persuades you that these tales are not separate. The same patient arithmetic, strap-checked, not redone, load balanced, governs loom and road. The goddess of measure and the god of procession agree on more than they argue about. Between them they carry the city where spectacle is a short season and continuity is the long one. Because a story about cloth should end where cloth meets life, you follow the peplos into its first week. Pinned on a young woman's shoulders, it moves through the agora like water in a proper channel. Hands brush it politely to judge the beating. Eyes note the bands and place the house. A seller of figs adds one extra to a measure because the hems are neat. A neighbour at the well admires the drape and asks whether the warp was set a finger wider this time. An old man, hearing the girl thank the fruit seller, says to no one in particular that Athenians once knew how to speak gratitude and are beginning to learn again. Nothing grand happens. Everything important does. Then a small accident teaches the value of foresight. A pin catches in a wicker basket. The wearer turns too quickly. The edge snags and pulls a weft into a tiny loop. Panic rises for a heartbeat and settles because Philia's daughter carries the small stick of spare weft in a pouch. At home, a lamp is lit before dusk. The loop is teased back into place with a bone needle. The weft's end is rewoven 3 passes and snipped. The place is pressed with a warm stone. The scar becomes a memory that will not widen. The Peplos returns to its work the next morning. A city lives or frays by the presence or absence of such sticks. You think about how this room converses with times beyond itself. Centuries later, someone will stand before a relief carved in marble, admire a drape caught by a chisel's intelligence, and talk about form. The people in this house would understand, but they might add, form is what happens when finishing is sound. Or you will step into a modern room humming with machinery, and notice that a woman there checks a selvage with the same 2-finger test Philia used, even if the language has changed, and the loom is loud enough to make speech a lip-read art. The continuity does not flatter the past, it explains the present. Before the lamp is pinched out, a last act returns the room to grace. Philia crosses to the little figurine in the corner, the workwoman with a rolled cloth, and lays a sprig of olive and a drop of wine near its base. She does not ask for anything. The day has already granted what days can grant when people practice measure. She acknowledges a debt that never closes, the one owed to the quiet instruction of tools and to the brass tacks kindness of neighbours. You have learned by now that this is the city's strongest temple, a room where skill praises order without spectacle. You stand in the doorway and watch the loom's outline sink into dusk. The weights hang motionless like a cord held after the song has ended. The beater rests against the crossbar, the heddle rod sleeps in its loops. Nothing asks for attention except tomorrow, and tomorrow is courteous enough to wait until morning. You leave with the sense that you have not only seen cloth made, you have seen justice in practice, equal tension, even chances, early correction, careful ending, goods stored with thought for the next user, gratitude offered to those who taught the hands that performed it. You carry one question with you, because stories in this series like to end with a question rather than a ribbon. In your own time, where production is quick and forgetting is quicker, which parts of this measured chain, patient counting, honest mending, planned finishing, would most strengthen the fabric of daily life if you practiced them again tomorrow? And what would you place in your repair jar so a small snag does not become an irreparable tear? At crossroads, small herms watch. Farmers measure steps, set stones, and trade oaths. Lines settle arguments. Harvests follow edges, and paths learn where to end. You begin on a margin, because most of life is lived there. The track you follow isn't quite a road, and isn't quite a path. It is something that has learned the weight of carts, and the patience of sandals. On either side, terraces hold olive trees whose trunks have grown into the shapes of careful decisions. Between 2 plots stands what you came to see, a boundary stone. It is not tall, it is not dramatic. It is a rectangular shaft of local stone, weather softened at the edges, set into a base whose earth has been tamped by feet that sought certainty. On its face, a nose that is little more than a ridge, and a beard that is mostly suggestion market as a herm, a square pillar, a head, a phallos that once was defined and now is worn by sun, and laughter, and time. This is the understated body of Hermes in the countryside, the god who patrols margins, roads, doors, borders, deals. People will tell you he protects travellers. The farmers here know he protects agreements. You approach as people do, a glance to see if the wreath from the last festival still droops there. It does, brown and honest. A touch with the fingers. Not to worship in drama, but to confirm that the stone's cool is still the same cool it was last week. The herm stands where two fields meet and where two families' memories braid into something more, formal than friendship and less brittle than law. You notice the small things that give a stone authority without make-believe, the packing stones at its feet, set in place so hooves and rain do not wobble the base, the faint chisel lines where someone trued aside long ago, a scratched mark that might be initials or might be a tally of how many times a boy on watch has been bored. You listen, and you hear the way Hermes is named when men want politeness. By Hermes, we said 3 cubits from the ditch, one farmer might remind another after a storm has chewed the terrace edge. It is not an oath, so much as an invitation to share a memory. The god's name turns I remember into we remember, and we remember turns a line in dust into something that can survive weather and sons-in-law. The countryside teaches you quickly that boundaries are not lines drawn once and left alone. Land moves. Water slumps a terrace wall. A root pushes and a stone in a dry wall shifts its opinion. Goats, which know nothing of Hermes and less of patience, nose through gaps to taste a neighbour's thistles and then declare themselves innocent. A boundary, then, is an ongoing practice. It is a visit after rain, a glance when you pass with a load, a pause to set a dislodged stone back on the wall and stamp your foot to seal the act. It is also a habit of speech. Your furrow runs true, said when it does. Shall we restring the line, said when it does not. You attend to the tools that make such talk less anxious. In a shed with a roof of reeds lies a line reel, a wooden spindle wound with cord that has learned the feel of chalk. On measuring days, the line is popped between thumb and forefinger and snapped against packed earth, leaving a pale kiss that directs a furrow or a wall. A rod, the length of a man's arm from elbow to fingertip, stands near the door. It is a cubit for this household, and its tip is burnished from being set against stones. The rod has a notch cut at half its length, and another at the span used for setting the distance of a plough from the boundary, so that a furrow does not drift into flattery of one's own side. Flattery here is the countryside's word for stealing, and it is a sin that starts small. A furrow eases outward a hand's breadth. A wall rebuilt after a slump leans in a little. A marker stone is lifted to reset a terrace face and then returned not quite where it stood. Hermes stands exactly for moments like this, not because he punishes, but because he keeps honest men honest by existing where their eyes land when they decide. You learn the customs. If a boundary wall collapses between neighbours, the work is shared unless lightning struck it, or a flood plainly tore it from one side. Then the loss leans where the blow fell, and the neighbour helps out of decency rather than obligation. If a tree grows on the line, its fruit is counted in a way older than argument. Whoever harvests first leaves the same number on the far side unless hunger has visited, in which case the fruit travels toward the hunger, and no one counts that year. If a channel carries water along a margin, the right to draw from it is set by sequence. First, second, third, timed by shadow on stone or by the length of a prayer spoken slowly. A boundary is less offence than a schedule pressed into earth. You attend a day when 2 men and an older woman, she has seen more harvest than they, agree to reseat a herm that has leaned after winter squalls. The tools are simple: a shovel with a wooden blade shod in iron, a pry bar made from an old plough tip, chocks from olive root. They clear the base, lifting earth with the care of people who know earth carries more than dirt. Roots, ants, worms, the memory of last year's rain. They do not move the stone without witnesses, not because they mistrust each other, but because they prefer memory to behave like stone. Another neighbour is fetched to watch and nod at the place where the base will return. Chalk line is snapped. The hole deepened a hand, the base tamped with a rammer whose head is olive wood, seasoned and smooth, driven with the slow, honest blows that seating requires. The stone is set upright by rope over a forked pole. The pry bar teaches the last inch of obedience. A single jug of water is poured around the base to settle dust into mud and mud into cement. The older woman ties a rush around the shaft and pats it the way you pat a donkey that has done what you asked without fuss. No curse is spoken, none is needed. The stone knows the village again. You recall, because the city likes stories, that once, before your time, the herms in Athens were mutilated in a single night, faces and phalloi hacked away, rumour and fear riding the dawn. What that taught people in the fields was not about treason or politics, but about how quickly confidence can drain away when markers are violated. Trade paused, voyages were delayed, men looked over their shoulders as if lines in their minds could be shoved by a bad dream. The countryside learned the same lesson each winter in miniature. When a herm leans, men lean towards suspicion. When it stands true, men stand more easily with one another. Hermes, the god who is honoured by stones at roads and fields, likes offerings that keep travel smooth and agreements clear. You have seen simple gifts at these posts: a sprig of olive stuck into a crack, a smear of honey that ants will clean, a tiny cake of barley flour a child was allowed to carry. On the eve of a festival, ivy may be tucked around the head as a joke borrowed from city herms, but in the fields the language is plainer. One farmer taps the stone with the back of his knuckles before hitting the first furrow of spring. Another, when a son is born, touches the pillar and says the child's name aloud, as if to enrol him in the map long before he can walk it. You look at how boundaries knit into work. A plough, wooden beam with iron. Share is set so that its right-hand run leaves a solemn margin by the herm. The soil there is left unploughed, not from superstition, but from arithmetic. Every furrow that respects the line will, by the time the terrace ends, have respected each neighbour's yield by the same margin. During harvest, sickles swing with a rhythm learned in youth. 1, 2, 3, and a glance where the stalks near the edge stand. You are told a small story. A boy once took one step beyond, and an older hand stopped his wrist with fingers gentle as a kind trap. "Count to the stone and back again," the older voice said. "Let the count keep you truer than your eyes." You measure again, this time in paperless law. Solon and other lawgivers wrote words about boundaries, penalties for moving markers, fines for planting encroaching trees too near walls where roots would pry. But in the fields, the enforcement is older than writing. A man who moves a stone risks more than fine. He risks bad neighbours. Bad neighbours are expensive in a way no court can tally. You cannot leave your tools to rest by the wall. You must send a child to watch the goats. You have to speak carefully at the well. You lie awake when wind rises and wonder whether in the morning the wall will be lying as well. The cost is measured in worry. Hermes' pillars reduce that cost like good roads reduce a mule's fatigue. You walk a boundary that winds like thought. Dry stone walling is itself a form of writing. Each stone remembers where the last wanted it. Here a face stone turns to the outside. There a hearting stone fills a dark hollow. Underfoot the path's camber shows where carts chose their compromise between wall and drop. In a gap where a flood tore last winter, someone has driven a line of wicker hurdles, staked them with coppiced shoots, and woven them tight. Silt will settle there, and the wall will be rebuilt in a season when hands are freer. And Olive's roots worry another stretch. They are trimmed this year with a saw whose teeth were set yesterday by a cousin. Even the saw's set has to respect the line. A too wide kerf makes waste. A too narrow makes burning and rage. Along the line, little things multiply into confidence. A shared gate is hung on posts that stand equally within both plots. The latch lifts and drops with the easy honesty of a knife that has been sharpened and kept. Children are told to leave stones on top of the herm when they pass. When the stones fall, someone has jostled what should not be jostled. Shepherds adjust their route so goats drift away from young vines. A boy trails behind with reed and pebble to click at animals that forget. At dusk, the boundary takes on the character of a habit. A last look on the way in, a feeling in the feet where the ground changes under the step, a note in the head, check after the next rain. It will be remembered because the head is trained to remember such notes. You spend a day with a survey that pretends to be ordinary. Two cousins inherit adjacent strips after a father's death. The will spoke clearly in words, but words must be translated into terraces. 4 men gather with rods and line. A 5th, old but sure, brings a wax tablet on which a rough plan is scratched. A rectangle here, a bend there, a tree that witnesses because it has been standing longer than any of them. They stretch line from herm to corner and from corner to ditch. They lay rods and count. 1, 2, 3, to a turn. 4, 5, to the almond. 6, to the place where the dry spring sometimes remembers itself after winter. They do not rush. They do not joke much. They say a sentence you will hear many times in the country and almost never in the city. Let it be easy to live with later. The day ends with small rites that are not called rites. A wedge of cheese is cut with a knife that earlier trimmed the line. That is not sacrilege, it is thrift, and thrift is a cousin of honour. A jug of watered wine is passed, not first to the eldest this time, but to the man whose field gives up the only flat spot where everyone can sit. The stone is touched once more, lightly. A sprig of fennel is left in a crack. A boy says what he's seen. We set it straight. And the saying parts fear from memory. The herm stands in its correct smallness and turns argument into advice. You walk home with the margin in your head and notice how many kinds there are. Door lintels divide outside and inside, thresholds announce it. Hearth rims keep fire from floor. A ring of ash around a pithos keeps mice from climbing, and theft from being easy. Even speech has herms, phrases that mark the edge between fairness and flattery. That's close enough to true, someone will say when a tale leans. Then quiet will follow, and the teller will straighten the next sentence without the humiliation of being named a liar. Hermes presides there too, tender of tact as much as of travel. At night, after a day of boundaries, the house rests more easily than on days when lines blur. You sit in the doorway because doorways are also margins, and you listen to a donkey's bell argue that peace is a rhythm more than a silence. The herm out in the field stands in the dark, unseen but present, a cool fact that keeps neighbours from inventing stories about one another. You understand why farmers favour this god. He turns agreement into an object you can knuckle twice and walk away from. If you wanted a grander lesson, you could make one. You could say that the city survives because it respects its own herms, offices, courts, customs, and that when those are hacked at in the night, confidence drains and the ships wait. But here, among terraces, the lesson is older and humbler. It asks only this: when the rain shifts the wall and roots pry at the stones, will you and your neighbour meet at first light with line, rod, and a calm breakfast in your bellies? Or will you each measure alone and let suspicion do the talking? You return to the margin because boundaries do not keep themselves. A week of wind has passed. The path wears new scuffs where hooves slid on loose grit. The herm you watched being reseated stands straight, its shadow a neat plank on the ground. You kneel and press your palm to the base. The soil has crusted where the settling water dried. A ring of small pebbles shows where someone, likely a child, decorated the foot for no other reason than that hands want to help. You sweep away a tuft of straw, not out of piety, but to make sight easier next time. Good boundaries begin with good visibility. The day's first task is quiet proof. You walk the edge with a rod and a coil of line, not because anything has obviously moved, but because checks prevent quarrels the way oil prevents squeaks. The rod is still the house's cubit, its end capped with a slip of bronze fitted years ago by a smith who preferred neatness to flourish. Every 10 paces you set the rod on the wall's top course and look for level by eye. It is not exact like a modern instrument. It is exact enough for neighbours to agree. Where the wall dips, you mark the place with 3 pebbles on the coping. That will remind you to bring a basket later and add hearting stones beneath. At the first corner you pause because corners hold more than angle. Here the path turns and the terrace drops, and at this meeting a second herm stands, less worn than the first. Its head still carries a suggestion of curls. The phallus is blunted by courtesy and sand, as boundary gods eventually are. Someone has smeared a thumb of a honey on the face. Ants make a small procession. You note the offering without comment. People thank certainty in the language they have available. Honey is decent Greek for stay put. You step off a span from herm to wall where goats pressed too close last week. Your neighbour meets you there without being sent for, his rod in hand, his boy behind him with a small basket of flat stones. The rods cross like spears and make a laugh that is not warlike. It is ceremony at the level of chores. He says what you were going to say, the edge is thin there. You answer with the simplest sentence the countryside trusts: let us fix it now. The fix is ordinary. You lift 2 coping stones, scrape the dust, seat a larger hearting stone under the lip so the wall's weight rides down rather than out. You beat the line of the wall with your palm and feel the vibration of a structure that has agreed with itself again. The boy brings the flat stones, you wedge them into the back face where the slope has slumped. None of this will be noticed by anyone a week from now unless it is not done. Then everyone will notice. Boundaries are like lamp wicks, invisible when tended, obvious when neglected. Work slides into talk as it does when backs bend. Your neighbour mentions news from the lower road. The cart lost a wheel at dusk when the driver hurried, and a rut chose the lesson. The men, walking behind, righted it with levers. A spoke cracked. A pin was whittled from olive to serve until morning. The driver swore he would leave earlier next time. You nod because the story is the same story a boundary tells. Begin a little sooner, finish a little calmer, and the day will cost fewer repairs. At mid-morning you follow the line down to the watercourse. A channel, not much wider than your hand, carries winter's surplus and spring's first generosity along the margin between two plots. Upright stones, shoulder high, mark 3 drawing places. Each bears a notch at a different height. The lowest belongs to the upstream neighbour, the next to you, the highest to the field below. The notches are neither sacred nor arbitrary. They are a schedule you can point to. Water is drawn by sequence, first until the flow drops to the first notch, then second until it drops to the next, then third. If rain has been hard and the channel fat, the order cycles twice. Timing is set by shadow. A pebble's shadow length laid along the stone tells you when a turn ends. The device offends nobody because it favours nobody. Hermes presides over such compromises with a small smile. You test the channel's bed by heel. Silt has collected at a bend. With a flat spade you lift the heavy mud, set it on the downstream wall, and smear it smooth with the back of the blade. It will dry and harden in a day. Stones set into it tomorrow will resist the next scouring. You pluck rootlets and set them aside. A bad route is an argument with a schedule. It chokes water and invents excuses for men who prefer not to share. You prefer to remove excuses early. At the channel's end, a ditch turns toward the olives. Roots have been creeping under the wall's base. You cut them with a saw whose teeth you set last month at the neighbour's wheel. The saw sings a small, dry song. The cut is neat. You dust the wound with ash to discourage fungus. You rub the saw's teeth with a dab of oil from a rag tied to your belt. Tools mind boundaries as surely as men do. Disputes, when they happen, present like a dull ache rather than a wound. Today's arrives in the form of 2 cousins from the far terrace, who have been arguing under their breath about a fig tree that grew fat across a line. The tree began as a sprout left to shade a jar one hot summer. Nobody planned a consequence. Now its roots have lifted 3 stones, and its crown leans toward the neighbour who prunes better. The cousins stand with the careful blandness of men who would prefer their wives to sort it while they pretend to be at the well. You do not laugh. You fetch the rod and the line and ask them to set them with you. When a quarrel carries tools, it is less likely to carry shame. The method is plain. You string line from herm to corner. You let the tree trunk declare on which side its centre lies. The wall will be set to the line, not to the root's ambition. Then you cut 2 long limbs, one that crosses 2, boldly, another that will become a new lead on the tree's proper side. You smear pitch on the cuts out of a superstition that is also a prophylactic against rot. The cousins agree to harvest by the old rule this year. First take a leaves as many on the other side, then to revisit next spring when the new lead declares itself. You ask them to speak the plan aloud. They do. The plan is no better for being spoken. It is more durable for being heard. You remember that the city has written penalties for moving markers, heavy fines, and a curse in public inscription for men who dig up herms, and yet nothing enforced by a magistrate competes with the country's preference for being able to meet a neighbour's eyes at the well. When someone does wrong, the correction is to return the stone and the manners both. Hermes' tricks have no place here. You can keep them for the city where cleverness is sport. The year turns while you keep to this line. In spring you clear the winter's bounty of small slides before planting asks for attention. In summer you walk at dawn to rewrite a stone that slipped during an evening watering. In harvest you drop a handful of grain near the base because your father did, and because comfort helps backs work straight. In winter you check after each squall because water forgets agreements until reminded. The herm receives wreaths in the season of rural festivals, and after the wreaths turn brown, the god receives a sweep with a broom of fennel so letters, if there are any, can be read again by old eyes. You keep an eye for artifice because thieves are rarely dramatic. A small trick is common in thin years. A man lifts the outermost coping stone, slides it an inch inward, then fills the exposed edge with dirt and sprinkles a little gravel on top to mimic age. The fix is to read textures like words. Old surface has lichen and the fine dust hardens into a thin crust. New fill shines in a way only fresh disturbance does. When you see the shine, you do not accuse in loud sentences. You lift the stone back with a grunt and a joke about goats. You stamp the edge with the same boot you used last week. If the man meant harm, he will find the wall arguing with him every time he tries. If he meant thrift, he will find it cheaper to ask than to steal. This is how a village chooses peace over court. Sometimes the city intrudes usefully. An itinerant surveyor arrives, a man with a staff taller than himself. A korobets, he calls it. A level made of a frame, plumb lines, and a trough for water. He sets it on 3 stones and watches the surface settle. He's proud of the device the way a fuller is proud of his vat. He offers to test your terrace lines for a fewer bowls. You pay him 1 and a loaf. He sights along the water and marks with his stylus a place where your wall rises slightly and makes a dam for water that should pass. You adjust the next day by lifting 2 stones and laying them flatter, a tiny move that saves a dozen in the next storm. The surveyor walks on, his frame bobbing like a banner. You're glad instruments exist. You're also glad the village checks daily with less gear. Because boundaries and harvest share a ledger, you spend an afternoon on markers that have nothing to do with stone. In the olive yard, a ladder leans into an older tree that spreads a shade big enough to hold a family. Ladders are also boundaries. You mark the rungs with a knife. 1 notch for the 5th rung, 2 for the 10th. So anyone who borrows it can return it at the same height, with the same respect for strain. A borrowed ladder returned a rung weaker is an argument waiting to rise. You oil the side rails and leave the ladder in the shade. It will dry slower there and split less. Care of tools is also care of lines. At the field's lower edge, a cart track crosses the margin at a shallow angle. The ruts have deepened this season because a man made 3 trips in rain rather than 2 in dry weather. You and your neighbour agree to lay brush and stone in the rut, a mattress that persuades wheels to ride higher and spread weight. You set a stake with a strip of rag tied high, yellow, the easiest to see at dusk, to warn drivers who like their pace too much. If a man tears the rag and throws it aside, you will know his name from the rag in the ditch. A marker that moves invites memory to follow. On another day, the boundary asks for a kind of arithmetic that includes kindness. A widow on the far terrace cannot lift stones as she once did. A corner near her plot has slumped twice. You and 2 neighbours carry baskets of angular rock from the quarry's edge and rebuild the corner to the line, adding a half course of smaller stones set at a tilt to shed water. No one mentions payment. Someone leaves a sack of barley at her door that evening. Hermes is not the only god with a hand here. Hestia's hearth and Demeter's field have their claims. But the Herm witnesses the act and makes note, as stones do, in silence. You keep track of words that belong at boundaries. Some are proverbs. Straight is cheaper, an old man says, tamping a post. A crooked wall buys nothing but excuses. Some are instructions that prevent anger later. Call me when you begin, you tell a neighbour who plans to extend a wall. I will hold the line for you. Some are questions that rescue pride. Is this where your father set it? You ask a man whose wall is drifting. He will hear the implied permission to move it back without hearing an accusation of theft. Language at margins matters as much as chalk and rod. In late summer, you see what happens when a boundary is treated as theatre instead of practice. A new man, brought in by marriage, tries to make a show of strength by building a wall tall and thin along his side. Stones chosen for size more than fit. Faces proud, joints careless. It looks impressive for a week. Then wind makes an opinion, and the wall answers by lying. Down. The village does not laugh in his hearing. A neighbour helps him sort stones by shape, shows him how to tilt the back face into the slope, and interlock courses like fingers, and has him lift 1 heavy stone down so 2 lighter can do the job better. The Herm at his corner remains aloof and patient. He learns that boundaries are built for rain and goats, not for men's posture. You tend to paperwork of the countryside, a phrase that means a wax tablet when a land sale is formal, and a line of witnesses when memory is strong. Today a small sale happens, 3 short strips from a man whose sons left for the city. The tablet records the length along the line, the distance from Herm to Almond, the right to draw water third on days when the shadow at the drawing stone ends a span past the notch. Names are pressed in with styluses, witnesses add marks. The Herm is touched to seal the memory, not because stone remembers better than wax, but because wax can be melted and whispers changed. Stone forces people to change their whispers to match. Because Hermes mines roads as well as walls, you look where your track meets the wider way. A milestone, nothing grand, just a squared stone with a faint numeral, stands where carts turn toward the city. Its face is worn by shoulders that leaned while men awaited company. You brush dust from the number with a sprig. Distances matter when you plan markets. A sense for how far a donkey can carry sacks before it asks for water is also a boundary, the one between a good day and a frayed one. You count paces from the herm to that milestone and store the number where you keep other useful measurements. Rod lengths to the well, steps across the threshing floor, heartbeats between lamp care and sleep. A storm finally gives you a test that is not hypothetical. Rain barrels down from the high scrub and hits the terrace wall sideways. 2 gaps appear in the morning, low and honest, the kind that come from water looking for the easiest story to tell. You do not blame the neighbour, you fetch baskets and call him anyway. You lay a drain, a small culvert of flat stones with a cover course, and lead water under the wall rather than through it. You set a leaf of olive above the drain and say out loud, "Here is the place." The sentence is as much for yourself as for him. In 3 storms the drain will look as old as the wall. A leaf will remind your eyes where to look first. Evening brings a walk along the whole edge with no tools, just hands and sight. You touch uprights, tap coping stones with knuckles to hear whether they ring true. A hollow ring says a space needs filling. Push the gate to feel the hinges mood. Pull at one strap that keeps goats honest. You remove a thorn from the strap and pocket it. Thorns in thongs become cuts, and cuts become quarrels, and quarrels grow into words no village wants to spend the winter digesting. You leave a pebble on the herm because boys will count them tomorrow and feel tall. Before you go in, you do what your father did without thinking. You thank the stone under your breath for being there to argue on your behalf when you're not looking. Gratitude aimed at rock sounds foolish in town squares. Here it sounds like an investment that pays out in neighbours who sleep well. Hermes receives no hymn, he receives your palm on his cool face, and the courtesy of work done while the light is good. You sit by the threshold and let the day collect itself into a neat bundle. You fixed a thin place, you trimmed roots, you reset 2 stones, you mediated a figure, you cleared a drift from the channel, you paid a surveyor 1 a bowl and accepted his advice. You rebuilt a widow's corner, you taught a man to tilt his wall into weather rather than toward opinion. None of these actions will be told as stories in winter. That is their virtue. They prevent the kind of tales that begin with "he moved the stone" and end with "and we didn't speak for a year." What remains as the lamp is trimmed and a donkey's bell settles to silence is the plainest question in the countryside, and the one that keeps peace when cleverness goes to town. When you next see a line going slack, wall, word, schedule, strap, will you call a neighbour to the margin with rod and rope while the sun is still up, or will you let the night invent reasons for you both? Night teaches a boundary as surely as daylight does. In darkness the line does not disappear. It widens into a zone of guesswork unless you have practiced it in the sun. You step out after moonrise because clouds earlier hid the hill, and rain carried murmurs down the gullies. The air smells of wet thyme and calmed dust. From the house, a low lamp glows the colour of olive oil in a small bowl. From the lane, the donkey's bell gives 1 flat note, testing whether the world still answers. You walk the path that is more memory than track and find the herm by reaching before seeing. Palm out, fingers forward, cool stone greeting skin. The pillar is steady, but the soil around it feels newly soft. Water has run along the margin and sought an easier story. You kneel and pinch a clot that yields like fresh kneaded bread. It will set by morning if tamped now. You heal the rim all around, not hard, not showy, just enough to invite earth to remember itself. Night repairs are like gentle words spoken before sleep, not enough to rebuild a wall, enough to prevent a quarrel by breakfast. Wind crosses the terraces with the sound of someone drawing a blanket that is larger than the land. A fox prints the damp earth, reads your heel marks, and chooses to be elsewhere. Far downhill a cart rattles late, its driver having tried to beat dusk, then rain, then the rut that declines argument. You think what farmers always think at night, that boundaries are partly for the day and partly for the thoughts that visit in the hour before sleep, promising to turn into suspicions if not met by facts before morning. Morning brings the facts. The ditch below the east wall is puddled. 2 stones in the dry wall sit a hair proud, thin shadows at their lower edges. You mark them with a twig and fetch a basket. The work is the same work as yesterday and the day before. Lift, scrape, seat, heart with smalls, beat the coping with a flat palm to feel if the vibration now runs through stone and slope together like joined breath. Your neighbour arrives without summoning. He felt the wind too. He checks his herm with one knuckle too. He hands you a wedge of bread because he knows you have not eaten and you will insist you have. He stands at one end of the stone while you stand at the other and says, "Ready?" The word means lift. It also means live together. Today the village asks more of the line than quiet checks. A field has changed owners by marriage. A strip that once answered to one house now needs to answer to two by way of a dowry. A man, cautious and newly proud, brings a wax tablet with names scribed by someone neater than himself. A woman, practical, older, the dowry's mother, wears a face that has counted blankets and sacks before this marriage was planned. Two uncles ask for the old line, meaning not the one anyone remembers, but the one everyone can live with tomorrow. You fetch rods, line, chalk. They fetch patience. Hermes receives a quick touch from 4 fingers. No prayer beyond watch us. You begin at the only place anyone will accept, the herm that has stood longer than all the living. It becomes a sentence starter for the land. Line is snapped to the corner stone, not because corners are moral, but because they prevent arguments from wandering. You ask each party to hold the rod while you sight along the cord. Hands learn honesty when they carry a tool correctly. Your eyes measure distance, your ears count breath. A child is told to call out the number of steps between stakes. He calls too loudly, and is told to call in a voice that will fit back inside the house later. The boy understands. A boundary walks with you even when you go to the hearth. Halfway down the strip, the line meets a tree. It is a young almond, not yet grafted, sprung by accident from a pit spat in a forgetful spring. The tree stands a thumb over the cord and will grow into habit if not addressed. You do not tell anyone to cut it. You tell them where to tie it back and how to set a new stake a hand length to the proper side. Let the tree learn the line while it is small, you say, and no one misses the other lesson travelling in the same words. The new husband nods. The mother hides a smile by searching her bag for a bread end to give the child. By noon, the rods have walked the field as if they were legs. The chalk has kissed earth and stone. The cord has been wound back onto its reel and set aside like a sentence saved for another talk. You press styluses into wax, herm to corner, so many cubits, corner to ditch, so many, water drawing, second turn, on even days. Witness marks are added, the woman collates dowry goods aloud, 3 poploi, 1 sack of barley, 2 lamps, a jar of oil. No one raises voice. No one is asked to swear as if fear were a solvent. The herm is touched by each of the new partners. A sprig of fennel is tucked into a crack, homely and green. The affair has been as dull as good bread, and it will hold as firmly. When error comes, and it will, it does not trumpet. That evening a boy breaks a strap on a gate that spans the margin. The strap has been cracked for a month. Everyone saw and meant to fix it. The gate sags. Goats read this as permission to edit the vine on the far side. You do not waste time resenting goats or boys. You fetch the awl, a new strap cut earlier from a tired sandal, and a peg to close the loop where a buckle once did. The strap is threaded, stretched, pegged, tested. You lower the gate and lift it again to feel the weight settle in the hinge the way a well-spoken promise sits in a room. You add a second peg, a belt and suspenders against a goat's ambition. The boy listens. He learns faster from the peg than from your words. Because Hermes minds roads as well as markers, you look beyond your edges toward the city where lines pretend to be straighter. In Athens proper, men debate weights and measures. They hang official rods and jugs beside stalls, so buyers and sellers can point to authority older than their quarrel. A decree existed long before today, cursing the mover of boundary stones. Hands cut it into stone so passers-by would learn that certain tricks earn not only fines, but the city's disapproval made hard. Farmers care less for curses than for neighbours, but the existence of the curse eases the shoulders anyway. It proves that the city occasionally remembers who feeds it. At the same time, you do not trust distant authority to hold what daylight and habit hold better. You draw on a potsherd, a rough map of the terrace, a line for wall, dots for herms, a mark for the drain where water is invited to behave. You hang the sherd on a peg near the door. It will not be used tomorrow. It will be consulted the day a cousin's child inherits and knows the shape of the land only as old songs. Clay remembers with loyal slowness. If it falls and shatters, the herms will still stand. and that is as it should be. A festival approaches, the rural Dionysia again, and even in Hermes' precinct it leaves a trace. Ivy is cut and soaked, masks are unboxed and aired, the skeiner cloth is checked for mouse dew. At the boundary, someone tucks 2 leaves of ivy under the herm's chin, more for wit than worship. Men walking past to carry poles and jars pat the stone with knuckles. A child gives it a cake freckled with sesame. The god of crossroads, thieves, luck and messages accepts these offerings with the same indifference with which he accepts proper seating and firm tamping. He's present as certainty, not spectacle. On the festival day itself, processions thread the lanes, and you borrow the donkey from Story 1 with a smile that is also gratitude. The animal's pace sets the tone for piety. Near the boundary, you halt and let the column compress and elongate. There, in crowd and laughter, a small temptation always appears, to angle one's cart over the edge and make space at a neighbour's expense. You stand by the gate and point without anger to the strap you replaced yesterday. "Let the strap be the line," you say mildly. The driver laughs and obeys because the courtesy came with the help of the strap, and courtesy tied to help is a better law than any man-made text. Seasons turn in their patient revolution. In late winter, you walk the line with a basket of small seed, barley to be scattered in the thin strips no plough should claim. It is not sacred, it is sensible. Grain cheers soil that would otherwise stand bare and invite gullies. You trickle seed where wall meets ditch, pat earth with a boot, leave the rest to rain. When green comes, it draws a delicate contour line along the margin, an honest drawing of property no court could improve. Spring flooding tests the drain you set with your neighbour. Flat stones, cover slab, olive leaf above as a sign. Water comes high and fast, finds the tunnel you offered, and goes under rather than through the wall. In the morning you check the downstream outlet and pull a tuft of reed that is lodged. You lift the cover and listen to the hollow, happy sound of water recognising a path. "Straight is cheaper," the old man once said. You add a second proverb of your own, muttered into the drain's cool, "Under is wiser." Summer heat lingers. Stones hold it into evening, olives breathe it back in dry sighs. Lines crack where clay dried too fast. You kneel with water and smear cracked patches on the wall's back, not to make it pretty, but to prompt dust to fall into itself and become cohesive again. You set a square of reed mat where goats have rub-marked a corner. You refuse the temptation to hurry. Haste is a kind of flattery aimed at yourself. It persuades you that speed makes you strong. The wall prefers humility, small tasks completed before they turn into stories. Stories, when they come in the countryside, often begin at boundaries. A cousin returns from the city with news that a band of young men has defaced a row of herms near the gate. Not from politics this time, but from wine and daring. City talk swells, magistrates vow penalties, priests perform cleansing, men shake heads and quote poets. Out here, the lesson fits in a short sentence. Stones keep courtesy. You repeat it to the boy who broke the gate strap because he is at the age when boundaries are a kind of dare, and because you love him enough to save him the long way round to this wisdom. Then autumn steps in, soft and persuasive, smelling of crushed leaves and caution. You bring in olives from trees that leaned correctly all year, thanks to the drains and the saw and the shared gate. Sacks, woven on Philia's loom in Story 2, sit heavy where the track begins to climb. The donkey stands with his usual long-suffering patience. You tie your knot the way the year taught it, once, twice, a turn back through itself so the weight rides the strap and not the knot. At the herm you pause without making a show of it. The boy touches the stone and grins without being told. The grin says, "I know where we are." A quarrel finally attempts to bloom. A man farther down the slope accuses his neighbour of stealing rain by deepening his own ditch so water speeds along the boundary and leaves less seepage for the thirsty terrace below. The accusation is thin. The tone is sharp. You do not call the magistrate, you call the surveyor if he is near. If not, you improvise with a rod, line, a trough of water and a patient hour. You lay the line level across the ditch and sight. You scratch a mark where the water would stand if the ditch were honest. You ask the accuser to look. He looks and sees that the ditch is not trickery, it is repair. You suggest a shallow basin of stone where the flow bends, a place where water eddies and seeps, a gift to the lower field that cost the upper none. The two men agree because they saw. and because you gave them something to build rather than something to regret. The herm watches, unimpressed and satisfied. It rains again in the first weeks of the new year, and you wake in moonless dark to that old sound of water writing its opinions on earth. You lie still and listen for trouble, then rise and walk the margin, because listening without looking tempts invention. The line holds, the drain sings, the strap holds the gate to its hinge. The herm is wet, its face slick as an eel, but its base does not wobble. You go back in and sleep the rare sleep granted to people whose next day is made cheaper by yesterday. At the end of a year measured by repairs, you sit with an old man who has long practiced the small diplomacy of stones. He says little and lets you speak, then adds the sentence you did not know you needed. Margins are where we pass things safely. You understand he means more than walls. Doorsills pass children from play into meal. Laws pass anger into talk. Festivals pass fatigue into laughter. The god at the boundary passes distrust into the comfort of habit. He pats the herm on the way home with fingers that have felt more crops than courts. You think of the city's proud phrases, then of his short one, and you decide which will keep your roof from leaking. Before the lamp is pinched out, you put the shirred map back on its peg, and the rod behind the door and the line reel in the box. You touch the cord and appreciate its taut humility. You look outward across the terraces and feel, not triumph, but relief at how much boredom you have defended. Quiet is the countryside's currency. You have kept it from inflation by beating dust into joints, by lifting stones with neighbours, by teaching boys to peg a strap, by inviting rain under a wall rather than through it. The herm is the receipt pinned to this work. You close with the only kind of question stones understand, the one that asks for a practical answer tomorrow, when the next wind slants in and you find a thin place in your wall, in your schedule or in your speech. Will you fetch rod, line, witness and time before the gap becomes a story? Or will you let the night teach you a lesson the morning could have made cheaper?